Chapter 928 Misdirection. At his point, Klein had roughly understood the situation. Due to the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence, he had been targeted by the spirit world plunderer the moment he entered Calderon City, which didn't even have ordinary dead spirits. It first moved the golden disk of unknown origins to the predicted path, allowing his marionette to see it while walking past. As such, his attention was transferred to the transformation effect Calderon City had on the living. Following that, it used the giant blacksmith, which wasn't its sole avatar, to distract him further. Finally, it secretly arrived within control distance and achieved success in one try. If it wasn't because I had seen those deceased bodies that are hung up like wind chimes at the cathedral, thus having an instinctual fear of high-sequence beyonders of the seer pathway, and having prepared several autonomous means to disrupt any exertion of control over me, I might have already been made a sole avatar by the spirit world plunderer. Seriously, I should have thought of the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence before I came in. After carrying the sea god scepter, even with the tyrant card suppressing it, I'm still a little too rash. I nearly missed out on such a crucial detail. On the surface, I did seem as cautious as I usually am, but in fact, I had turned rash without realizing it. Yet, I didn't even believe I was being rash. Klein's thoughts raced before he raised the bone scepter-wielding arm and continued using lightning storm. If once wasn't enough, make it twice. If that still wasn't enough, do it a third time. In short, he had to take this opportunity to prevent the spirit world plunderer from escaping from the range of his attacks. This was the safest method, and it was also Klein's fighting style that he looked up to the most. If it wasn't because lightning strike had been greatly weakened in Calderon City, he even suspected that he could have gone over to pick up the Beyonder characteristic already. And having already digested most of the Sequence 5 potion, his spirituality was sufficient enough for him to deal out such damage for a while. At this moment, the invisible figure wearing a translucent white robe burst into pale white flames. It appeared in midair several hundred meters away. The spirit world plunderer had used flaming jump, which was many times stronger than Klein's version, instantly pulling away from him. At the same time, in the rubble it was hiding in, a 4-meter-tall bluish-black giant staggered to his feet. The giant's chest was open, but there weren't any innards. However, it stood like a castle, standing in between the tyrant and the spirit world plunderer, blocking Klein's line of sight. And in Klein's eyes, its spirit body threads were gathered together, extending far towards the spirit world plunderer. It was obvious that it was a soul avatar. At the tip of the sea god scepter, the blue-colored gems lit up. A few bolts of lightning leapt out of thin air, mixing together into a huge silver arrow. Instantly, it smote the bluish-black giant's head. All the invisible defenses shattered, and like papier-mâché, the giant's head cracked. Countless bits of charred flesh splattered as his headless body evaporated amidst white gases that were tainted with dark green spots. All his vitality was robbed away. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. Klein, in his papal tiara and papal robe, raised the bone scepter even higher. The blue light radiated in ripples as howling wind blew up his cape. In a very large area of Calderon City's periphery, dark clouds quickly gathered. Under a suppressive layer, they made the area appear darker and more repressed. Smack. 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 Bean-sized drops of water smashed to the ground, releasing dust that had accumulated over time. Splash. The raindrops pattered at an increasing pace, forming a catastrophic storm. The water extinguished the pale white flames and formed a stream that gushed downwards towards the lowest point of the city, right for the end of the deep pit. In such weather, Klein's flaming jump had been made ineffective, but it was likewise for the spirit world plunderer. However, to a tyrant, his spirituality could spread through the dark clouds as though he had transformed into a deity that overlooked the land. Every dark cloud, every drop of water had become Klein's eyes. They allowed him to easily find the spirit world plunderer in every area that had its weather change. This invisible figure with the translucent white robe was hiding behind a broken pale white column. It hadn't left the periphery for the core region. Boom! A deafening boom sounded as bolts of lightning meshed to form a silver beam that shot out from the dark clouds, right at the spirit world plunderer. Relying on its potent spiritual premonition, the invisible figure burrowed into the ground half a second early. 3 thick silver beams smote the area one after another, melting the soil away as they sank downwards, producing charred craters. The spirit world plunderer emerged from another spot as it hurriedly dodged, keeping to the right at times and left at other times, as though it was carrying out a snaking dodge maneuver. However, regardless of where it fled to, the silver beams would chase up to it. They even blocked its path ahead of time, preventing it from attempting to leave the stormy region. Boom! 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 The deity akin to a tyrant, who looked down from the dark clouds at the spirit world plunderer, waved his scepter and struck down again and again at his target, with success barely eluding him several times. Klein turned more and more anxious, eager to immediately end the hunt. Hence, he unreservedly triggered the sea god's scepter to increase the frequency at which bolts of lightning struck down. Suddenly, he felt a strong sense of exhaustion. This alarmed Klein, for he realized that something was amiss. The spirit world plunderer had the chance of retreating deeper into Calderon City at the beginning, so why is it staying around? It's clearly a spirit world creature without a physical body. It can burrow underground to avoid the lightning in a tyrant's notice, so why is it circling around from time to time? It's trying to make me attack. It has noticed that I'm not a demigod through my spirit body threads and my control over my marionettes. It wishes to drain me of my spirituality. Klein was alarmed. Combining it with his original encounter, he came to a realization of how intelligent the spirit world plunderer was. It was a rather crafty creature. At the same time, he also thought of a problem. Could lightning storm and the stormy rain attract the notice of dangerous existences in the core region of Calderon City? I'm too rash. I keep neglecting the critical details. As thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein put away the sea god's scepter. The heavy storm stopped as the dark clouds quickly scattered, the weather restoring to normal. Klein made Enzo return to his side with word of the sea, and he got Ludwell to protect him in the middle. Following that, he and his 2 marionettes walked out as though they were trying to leave Calderon City while he still had some spirituality left. During this process, Klein had his spirit body thread's vision constantly activated to prevent the spirit world plunderer from approaching him. He noticed that this creature's spirit body threads were somewhat special. A portion of them came out from its body and extended outwards normally. A number materialized externally and were bound together in a thick bundle, right into the translucent white robe. Klein suspected that this was the state when a spirit world plunderer controlled a soul avatar, making it different from a marionettist. As he shifted his gaze, he suddenly saw thin black illusory threads coming out from a collapsed house. A portion of them gathered into a thick bunch with its source in the distance. Klein didn't hesitate to raise his sea god's scepter, creating a sonorous thunderclap. Boom! Amidst this sound that struck awe into one's mind and spirit, Ludwell suddenly raised his left hand. Half his body instantly turned illusory as his arm extended out extensively, heading straight for the collapsed house. Midway, his palm turned abnormally pale white. An illusory face protruded out and stuck out with a snake-like tongue which had white fur covering its surface. The tongue reached out far, penetrating the wall and stabbing at the spot where the spirit body threads were gathered. It immediately sucked on a distorted and blurry soul. Around the soul, a number of spirit body threads suddenly disappeared as though they never existed. A portion of them was none other than the gathered bundle, the ones that came from afar. They were fake. The spirit world plunderer was able to create fake, illusory spirit world plunderers or instantly swap location between the soul avatar and itself. Klein suddenly turned his head and looked elsewhere. Indeed, he saw a blob of spirit body threads swim over from underground at a fast speed. He once again used Sea God's scepter, releasing a thunderclap close to the ground, one that could awe his spirit body. Meanwhile, Enzo expended some of his remaining luck, adding bad luck to the target. Then, he shot out a silver bolt of lightning from the tip of the word of the sea. The bolt of lightning rather luckily passed through a crack and entered the ground, striking the assailant directly. It caused a portion of the spirit body threads to instantly vanish. It was also fake. Just as Klein reacted, his thoughts paused and his body turned numb. Just as he opened his mouth with great difficulty to instruct the mystical item, the invisible figure in the translucent robe descended from above, landing right before him. The spirit world plunderer had been hiding high in the sky, cloaking itself with the grayish-white clouds. The moment this invisible figure appeared, maggots began crawling out of its collar where its head should be. They were maggots with strange patterns covering them. Just one look at them sent his mind reeling. Although he broke out of the control of his spirit body threads, he also lost his ability to think. His face that was shadowed by the papal tiara began to grow meat tendrils. Each tendril was relatively transparent, like squirming worms. If it wasn't for the tyrant card's level supporting him, he would have fallen to the ground while struggling in pain. The spirit world plunderer had a mythical creature form to a certain extent. At this moment, the invisible figure inside the white robe began to control Klein's spirit body threads without any obstacles in the way. In a few seconds, it was already close to succeeding. Seeing that its prey was about to become its sole avatar, the spirit world plunderer suddenly saw its target open his mouth with great difficulty and say a word. He had recovered from the state of nearly losing control faster than it had anticipated. And the word was in ancient Hermes, fate. It was the incantation for the fate siphon charm. If Klein really wanted to leave, he would have grabbed his two marionettes and directly ended the summoning to return above the gray fog. He wouldn't have walked to Calderon City's entrance. He was planting a trap for the spirit world plunderer. The reason why he could recover so quickly from the injuries dealt to him by a mythical creature form, and why he was able to chant the relevant word, was because he had experienced such situations too many times. Besides, although he wasn't sure what method his opponent was using, there was definitely a rather well-rounded way to deal with it, make his target unlucky. Just as Klein entered a sluggish state, his first reaction wasn't to make the mystical item sing, but to let Enzo expend all his luck, making the spirit world plunderer have enough bad luck. Chapter 929 True Soul Body, Fate. As the dragged-out and abstruse ancient Hermes term resounded, the spots where the spirit world plunderer and Klein stood suddenly darkened. It wasn't very obvious, as though a cloud had drifted over in midair without stopping. But when this illusionary shadow dissipated, the invisible figure that was donning a translucent white robe stood frozen on the spot. The surface of its clothes showed signs of worms crawling across it. It was sluggish, slow, and in a dire state. Across it, Klein's eyes had their lucidity return. The meat tendrils on the shadowed face beneath the papal tiara vanished. It appeared as though it wasn't the spirit world plunderer who had controlled Klein's spirit body threads and nearly succeeded. Instead, it appeared as though Klein was the one who was controlling it and had nearly converted it into his marionette. The fate siphon charm switched one's fate. This was a high-level charm made using a worm of time. It could siphon off the target's subsequent fate, and in a short period of time, burden it with that of the target's, so as to complete an exchanging of fates. Therefore Klein and the spirit world plunderer situations had switched. One went from death to survival, while the other went from victory to instant despair. After confirming that the spirit world plunderer was intelligent and extremely difficult to deal with, making it difficult to hunt it, Klein began putting on an act of retreating. He appeared rash as he deliberately walked into the spirit world plunderer's control, enticing its actions, ready to use the fate siphon charm at the critical moment. That way, what terrible acts the spirit world plunderer did to its enemy, the charm would then allow it to experience the same despair. Of course, if the fate siphon charm didn't have the expected effect, or if the spirit world plunderer's main soul didn't appear and had ended up using other means to control the situation, Klein still had his last trick up his sleeve to protect himself: directly end the summoning and return above the gray fog. He would sacrifice his two marionettes and a few mystical items in order to ensure his own safety. Without the time to marvel at how magical the fate siphon charm was, or how terrifying angels from the Marauder pathway were, Klein didn't hesitate to raise the sea god scepter high up before the swapping of fates ended. The dark blue papal robe flared up with the wind as the golden papal tiara emitted meshed blue and silver beams of light. At the tip of the white bone scepter, it shot out bolts of lightning that gathered into a ball before landing on the spirit world plunderer's body. A swath of silver color brightened up immediately, inundating the target, turning the surroundings white. Once, twice, thrice. Klein continuously triggered terrifying lightning balls, expending his spirituality without holding back. Finally, he heard a roar that seemed to stem from the depths of one's soul as he instinctively sensed that his target had collapsed and dissipated. Only then did Klein lower the sea god's scepter and watch the silver lightning sizzle away. At that moment, his entire spirit body had turned rather illusory. Even with the tyrant's augmentation, it didn't seem real. As the lightning dispersed, the invisible figure in the white translucent robe appeared once again in Klein's sight. Flickering light emerged from within as the spirit world plunderer's body cracked, turning into countless illusory bubbles that disintegrated bit by bit. The tyrant had succeeded in the hunt. At this moment, deep within Calderon City, there was a sudden quake. It was as though a massive creature had awoken as a result of the spirit world plunderer's death, or that countless dangerous creatures were surging out. The indescribable feeling combined into a swath of illusory grayish-white and, like a tidal wave, rose up from the bottom. Other spirit world plunderers? No, it appears to be a more terrifying and horrible creature. A being that the spirit world plunderer attends to? Also, in Calderon City's core region, at the end of the deep pit, it's still as silent as ever. There's no sound at all, making it more horrifying. Klein pumped himself up as he diverted some attention in order to monitor the situation inside Calderon City as he anxiously waited for the spirit world plunderer's characteristic to appear to form an ingredient. He wasn't relishing in the delight of a successful hunt but was pacing about anxiously at the edge of the abyss. During this process, Klein got Enzo and Ludwell to stay close to him. He threw the sea god's scepter to the former so as to escape the state of irascibility. He began considering how to deal with the subsequent development with a clear mind, as well as consider whether he had missed out on some other details. As the thoughts flashed in his mind, Klein suddenly recalled something. Back when he made the mystical items sing, Creeping Hunger had praised the true creator and had used his complete honorific name. Although the human-skinned glove had used Hermes instead of ancient Hermes or other languages that could stir the powers of nature, the former was still usable when it came to sacrifices. This also meant that the true creator might have very well heard Creeping Hunger's praises and noticed the commotion here. Apart from the rising grayish-white tide and the terrifying creature deep down in the city, there are other dangers. Wait, I'm now a spirit body, equivalent to a wraith. I'm not in my normal state. Just as Klein's mind thought of something, his spiritual perception was triggered as he instinctively cast his gaze at the entrance to Calderon City. The lights there flickered as a figure entered. The figure was wearing a simple and ordinary linen robe with a head of silver hair. He was a handsome man with soft facial features. His eyes were gentle with some hints of coldness. It was as though he was observing the fates of everyone in the world like a spectator. Behind him, there were beams forming illusory layers of pure wings. They spread outwards, blocking the entire entrance. Ili Klein nearly hissed through the gaps in his teeth as a series of titles and names flashed across his mind. Ouroboros. Tail Devourer. Angel of Fate. King of Angels. He didn't have the luxury of time to consider the possibility of his previous thought. His body expanded as though it was incorporeal, enveloping his marionettes, Enzo and Ludwell, the yet-to-appear characteristic, and the spirit world plunderer's remnant bubbles within. At this moment, Ouroboros's silver eyes already had the distant figure in his sights. It was a figure wearing a papal tiara and a dark blue robe, exuding extreme oppression and tyranny. There was a grayish-white fog that had been blurred by the tyrant's aura. A river of flickering light appeared in his eyes, seeming to circle the tyrant figure in the periphery of Calderon City. Silently, the square houses and the pale white columns stood up again despite being destroyed by the lightning storm from before. The charred legs of the giant blacksmith once again possessed a body as he appeared inside the tomb, striking at the anvil. All of this returned to what it was like shortly after the tyrant stepped in. However, Klein in his pontiff attire had vanished. His 2 marionettes along with the remnant bubbles of the spirit world plunderer had vanished as well. The corresponding figure was unable to return as the rebooted scene shattered, turning back to the desolate state after the battle. Tail Devourer Ouroboros watched silently for a long while before making a move. The grayish-white swath that rose up from the depth of Calderon City slowly receded back down. Above the gray fog, Klein slumped in the high-back chair of the fool in exhaustion. He wasn't even able to get Enzo and Ludwell to massage him. He had already thrown the sea god's scepter back to the junk pile. The tyrant card had left his soul body and was placed facing down beside the Black Emperor card. The spirit world plunderer's bubbles were floating ahead, with the Beyonder characteristic constantly seeping out before combining with the points of light. After resting for a while, Klein saw grayish-white powder fall onto the model table's surface. Following that was a transparent item that seemed weightless. The item was the size of a palm, formed by coiled maggots. It was almost shaped like a human, and its interior was filled with a colorless liquid. Bubbles often emerged, scattering black hints of light. Klein didn't dare to look at it carefully, as there was a more complicated structure in the weightless transparent object. They formed indescribable patterns and symbols that seemed to fuse knowledge, power, transformation, secrets, bizarreness, and madness within, making them no longer abstract. This made Klein feel very dizzy. His mind was even on the verge of breaking down, with his soul almost losing control. This is likely the true soul of the spirit world plunderer. I have the corresponding powder as well. There's about 70 grams, more than I needed. It's more than I expected. Klein nodded indiscernibly and stored the powder into a box. Together with the true soul body, he threw them on the junk pile and covered it with the gray fog. After completing this, he raised his hand to rub his temples and made a self-deprecating remark. If it wasn't for the sea god's scepter, I probably would have had to leave Calderon City due to the assault of the spirit world plunderer. I would then wait until I had helpers and could make the most solid of hunting plans so as to control the stirrings of the area to not alarm the unknown entity at the core region. Sigh, I was rash the entire time. Although the outcome was fine, it really doesn't suit my character. It's also completely at odds with the seer pathway's acting. In the future, I should try to avoid using the sea god's scepter in the outside world. The spirit world plunderer has been successfully hunted. There's no need for me to get Miss Sharon's help. In a few days, I'll write to her so that she won't be thinking over this matter. However, I have a premonition that I'll still be heading to Calderon City in the future. When that happens, perhaps I might still need Miss Sharon's help. In addition, I have to seek out information on Bizarro Baines. I can't put all my hope on the City of Silver. Amidst his thoughts, Klein directly returned to his body, without bringing his marionettes. He ended the ritual and headed straight for bed, falling asleep the moment his head hit the pillow. Escaped. Soas looked at the man opposite him and asked Daily Simone, who was carrying out a spirit channeling. They had just finished their operation and had captured a few numinous episcopate members. However, the key personnel the intel pointed at, Hand of White Palenque to Siblius, wasn't at the secret gathering point. He was a Sequence 4 demigod, therefore, not only had the Red Gloves team used a Grade 1 sealed artifact, they had even requested Goddesses Ilya's help. However, it was all futile. Daily Simone nodded. Yes. She then looked at the captive, suddenly speaking with an ethereal voice. Where did Palenque to Siblius go? He said he was going to meet someone, the numinous episcopate member answered slowly. Who is that person? Daily Simone pressed. Leonard Mitchell and company also cast their gazes over. The man who was being spirit-channeled answered with an unperturbed voice, in Sanguil. Chapter 930 Former Organization, in Sanguil. Upon hearing the name, all the Red Gloves present fell silent. Not a single one spoke for a moment. Ever since this former bishop betrayed and fled the Church of Evernight had never relaxed its pursuit of him. Archbishops and high-ranking deacons who took up high posts had taken turns being responsible for searching for him. They helped each other, often bringing the relevant sealed artifacts everywhere to search for clues about him. But ultimately, they were unable to lock onto Nsangwil. He slipped away as a result of all kinds of coincidences. His shadow wasn't even noticed. Furthermore, he had caused several major events that killed many Nighthawks. To the Church of Evernight, especially the Nighthawks, he was someone they hated that had also insulted them. Without realizing it, Leonard Mitchell had already clenched his hanging fists as his breathing grew deeper. He soon forced himself to extricate himself from the sudden emotions that emerged within him. He turned his attention to something else. It was no wonder Dwayne Dantes was able to meet Nsangwil on Waypoint Island in the Berserk Sea. It was because the latter's goal was also the southern continent, East Balam. Amidst everyone's silence, Daily Simone immediately used her spirit body to emit an ethereal voice without any obvious changes. With some coldness, she spoke at a quickened pace. "Where are they meeting?" The numinous episcopate member shook his head blankly. "I don't know." Daly raised a few more questions, but she didn't get an ideal reply. Finally, she took a step back and cast her eyes at the Red Gloves team captain, Soest. Soest sighed and deliberated over his words before saying, "First, we need to inform this piece of intel to Her Excellency, Goddess's Eye. We shall leave it to her to contact the Holy Cathedral. Ince, who has 0-08 with him, isn't someone a Red Gloves team can handle. Second, we should continue investigating and follow this clue pertaining to Palenque to Siblius. Let's hope that we can figure out Nsangwil's motives. With the situation of us not being able to track him or lock onto him, grasping his motives is more important than knowing where he is. Perhaps, it can help us set up a trap that he has no choice but to step into. Finally, from now on, everyone is to take note of any coincidences. Regardless of the reason, they are to be reported to me." "Yes, Captain," the Red Glove members replied in unison. Leonard maintained his silence as he turned his head to glance at Daily Simone. He found that this gatekeeper who addressed herself as a spirit medium was similarly silent. Her gaze was dark. At the same time, he heard Palez Zorost's slightly aged voice resound in his mind. "Heh, from the looks of it, I'll be witnessing a play of running and pursuing. What does old man mean? Is he hinting at something? We just decided to start investigations on Nsangwil's motives, and it's already known by 0-08? Leonard looked away and suddenly had an idea. If a person who is already dead was to secretly do the relevant investigation, would he be able to avoid 0-08's notice? After 2 hours of sleep, Klein rubbed his still throbbing head and slowly got out of bed. Following that, he pulled the bell by the side of the door and waited for an attendant to arrive. Before long, a native deliberately dressed in lone attire, a white shirt and red vest knocked on the door. Klein twisted the handle and opened a tiny gap in the door. He instructed with a hoarse voice, "Send another lunch set to the room. I had my meal too early." At that instant, he already looked like the tanned Enzo. As a gentleman living in a luxurious room with 2 servants, it was impossible for him to personally instruct the attendant at the door. "Yes, sir, a lunch set. Any special requests?" The native attendant took out some paper and a pen and began recording as he asked with a rather strange Loanese accent. Klein used an equally odd Loanese accent. "With braised meat as the main dish, match it with a cup of sparkling wine with ice and lemon." "Do I include 2 servant meals?" the native attendant asked, following the usual procedure. Klein was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "Yes." After ending the conversation, he closed the door and quickly set up a ritual, bringing back Enzo and Ludwell from above the gray fog to the real world. As for Creeping Hunger and Word of the Sea, he temporarily left them in the junk pile. One of them was starving, and the other could hardly resist the urge to sing. After Klein controlled the marionettes to clean up his room, a few attendants came to deliver lunch. Soon, the entire room was filled with the sounds of cutlery hitting the plate and a soft chewing sound. After some time, Klein put down his cutlery, picked up his napkin, and wiped his mouth. In satisfaction, he leaned backward and shook his head helplessly. If this continues, I'll really become fat. The two marionettes had already lost the ability to eat, but to conceal that fact, Klein had no choice but to add servant meals. With him unwilling to see food go to waste, he could only try to eat as much as he could. Thankfully I'm a faceless. Klein covered his mouth as he burped before drinking the last bit of sparkling wine. Only at this moment did he feel like he had recovered. He now had the energy to consider the various details of his trip to Calderon City. The Marauder pathway is truly terrifying. Just a charm created from a worm of time is able to achieve such incredulous effects. As a king of angels, it's obvious how terrifying Blasphemer Amon is. Even an avatar isn't easy to deal with. Thankfully, I didn't put on a brave front. I knew to mimic those with experience and directly fled to the southern continent. The true creator places a great importance on me. He directly got Tail Devourer Ouroboros to rush over. This does have a feeling of traveling across time. The angels on ancient murals are just walking out and standing before me. Thankfully, I was still able to directly end the summoning. Just as Klein thought of this, his expression sank as he discovered a serious problem. Ouroboros is a king of angels from the monster pathway. This also meant that he could directly see the uniqueness about him. He could see the grayish-white fog and see the illusory door formed of spherical lights and the transparent and translucent maggots that formed the spherical lights. What does this actually imply? The angel of fate who has survived since the second epoch should know something. And the true creator probably knows more. Could they be able to tell that I'm the master of the mysterious space above the gray fog? Regardless, the importance they place on me will rise. Klein clenched his right fist and put it to order, or Rose Redemption might take. He felt lucky that, be it Rose Redemption or the Aurora Order, they had yet to lock onto any of the Fool's believers. However, during the chaotic battle outside Biyao, when he was still active as Gehrman Sparrow, he had thrown out the Tinder Glove, which had been corrupted by the true creator, to attempt to attract a saint from the Aurora Order. This might very well have led to the crazy adventurer to enter the suspect list. From the clues extending outward from Gehrman Sparrow, there's Admiral of Stars, Vice Admiral Iceberg, Danitz, and Anderson. All of them will be investigated by the Aurora Order. I have to warn them. Klein slowly exhaled and stood up, prepared to head above the gray fog. From his point of view, the pursuit of Gehrman Sparrow by the military, Church of Storms, Rose School of Thought, and Numinous Episcopate were all different. The true creator's believers were rather crazy and had a king of angels, a leader who was good at prying into the secrets of fate, active in the real world. This way, it didn't matter if Katlia and company were at sea, making it difficult to be locked on. There was still the risk of them being found. Among them, Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina and the Fog Sea's strongest hunter Anderson weren't people Klein was worried too much about. They knew little, nothing that pointed towards the core problem. Nothing much would happen aside from the need to consider whether the bunch of lunatics of the Aurora Order would employ extreme methods in the interrogation process. West Balam, Northern State. In the Kukua city ruled by May Sanchez. Danitz, who was chewing on roasted meat, paused suddenly. He heard Mr. Fool pass him the warning from Gehrman Sparrow. Be careful of the Numinous Episcopate. Be careful of the Aurora Order, especially the latter. Pay special attention. Also, warn Anderson Hood as well as Edwina Edwards. Be careful of the Numinous Episcopate. Be careful of the Aurora Order. How many has it been? The military, Church of Storms, Church of Evernight, Rose School of Thought. What did Gehrman Sparrow do? Why has he offended so many factions? Dogs hit. Danitz's expression froze before grimacing. He had no idea that the strongest person of the 7 pirate admirals had changed. Opposite him, Anderson put down the knife he used to slice meat, pricked up his brows, and curiously asked, "Have you recalled something?" Danitz secretly took a deep breath and asked after some deliberation, "Have you heard of the Aurora Order?" He wasn't sure if Anderson knew. After all, the Aurora Order was a rather secretive organization in the beginning. Its reputation was later built up in the Lone Kingdom. Anderson chuckled. I'm actually more surprised that you know of them. Did your captain tell you? Without waiting for Danitz to answer, he combed his short hair with his finger and continued, they believe that the Creator is omnipresent. Everything has godhood. They believe that life is nothing but a spiritual journey. As long as one is willing to listen to their preachings, understand, discover, and gather the godhood, they will eventually become angels to transcend reality. Such an idea doesn't sound bad, but that's not the main point. The main point is that they believe in the true Creator. Upon hearing that, Danitz couldn't help but jeer. You know quite a bit, just slightly less than I know. Anderson immediately curled the ends of his mouth and said with a beaming smile, of course. I once joined an organization in Intis. They hope to change society, the world, to make the supernatural no longer secret and to be out in the open for everyone to see, so as to become true rulers. They're called the Iron and Blood Cross Order, and they also believe in the true Creator. Danitz's expression froze as cold sweat oozed out of his forehead. Chapter 931 New Method to Acquiring Intel. Glancing at Danitz's expression, Anderson continued as though he didn't notice a thing. However, their brains appear to have been eaten by zombies. They were fervent to the point of stupidity. They didn't adhere to my sense of aesthetics. So after cheating them of their things, I quit. Why's your face a little pale? You're even sweating. Did you get heatstroke? As a hunter, shouldn't adapting to the environment be an intrinsic ability? Danitz lifted his right hand and wiped his sweat. Cursing inwardly, he forced a smile and said, I've heard that once someone believes in an evil god, it's almost impossible to escape the faith. As he spoke, he raised his chin slightly, wearing a look as though he was musing over the circumstances of his future death. It didn't cross his mind that Gehrman Sparrow had just offended the Aurora Order and was being targeted by the true Creator's believers. He also didn't make the connection that he was believing in a suspected evil god, the fool. Well said, Anderson replied with a smile that didn't have the slightest hint of gloom. It's not like I have any true faith. Back then, the incantations I said were lines I modified from the God of knowledge and wisdom. Since they don't really enjoy using their brains, no, they don't even have that. As long as you superficially appear devout, any random excuse can be used to fool them. Without waiting for Danitz to develop the discussion further, he asked, Why are you suddenly asking about the Aurora Order? Danitz bit down on his roasted meat and slowly chewed and swallowed. After a deliberate pause of 20 to 30 seconds, he said, I just recalled something. For some reason, Gehrman Sparrow has been identified by the Aurora Order as a high-priority elimination target. Oh right, there's also the Numinous Episcopate. And both you and me are known to have relations with him. You want me to be careful against the Aurora Order and the Numinous Episcopate? Anderson nodded in enlightenment as he chuckled. You've recently mentioned something similar. Rose School of Thought, Church of Storms, Lone Military. Man, at times, I even feel that Gehrman Sparrow is more suited to being a hunter than me. Danitz could hardly retort as he nodded heavily in agreement. Anderson thought for a moment when he suddenly changed topics out of the blue. What do you plan on doing here in West Balam? Helping Gehrman Sparrow with something? Upon hearing this question, Danitz fell silent for a second. He put down the item in his hand and tidied his clothes in an unhurried manner. Investigate the faith of the different classes of West Balam. This was determined after his discussion with Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. In common parlance, it meant investigating the developments of the various secret organizations and factions in West Balam. Of course, this included some preliminary contact with the local ruling forces, and to figure out if they had any desire to purchase firearms. Investigate the faith of the different classes of West Balam, Anderson repeated Danitz's words as he reflectively raised his right hand to rub his temples as though he had a headache. After the end of the tarot gathering, and warning Admiral of Stars to take note of the Aurora Orders and Numinous Episcopates' investigations, with the best choice being seeking the Moses Ascetic Order's help, Klein busily finished the three-party transaction between the world, the moon, and the sun. He received £5,000 in return. After dinner, he bit on an unlit disguised smoke pipe as he read the papers. Then, he saw Miss Messenger walk out of the void to deliver him a letter. Leonard's. Klein reached out to receive it and noticed that Rionette Tinker didn't stay at all. She had rapidly returned to the spirit world. This also made him determine that Leonard Mitchell had already paid the mailing fee, hence, he took out his other hand and unfolded the letter. Ince Zangwill has appeared in East Balam. He's suspected to have met with Palenque Tesiblius from the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction, Ince Zangwill. Klein ruminated over the name as he slowly leaned back into his reclining chair. In the letter, Leonard wished that he could do some investigations in secret to figure out Ince Zangwill's motives. But the problem is that 0-08 has the characteristic of any mention of it will be known. Knowing of it also means being known by it. Besides, it's good at arranging coincidences, making people follow its directions without even realizing it. Under such circumstances, it's very difficult to avoid 0-08's notice while investigating Ince Zangwill. Not only is there no chance of success, it's also easy to expose myself. As Klein thought, he made Enzo walk behind him and begin massaging his shoulder. He read Leonard Mitchell's letter again, hoping to find more clues and incisive points for investigations from those few words. East Balam. Numinous Episcopate. Artificial death. Palenque Tesiblius. Why is Ince Zangwill looking for them for? Trying to find allies for the true mastermind behind the Great Smog of Backlund, that royal family's faction? Artificial death. Artificial death. As Klein thought, he suddenly recalled that there was a matter that no one knew other than himself and Mr. Azek. The Evernight goddess had preliminary gained control of the death pathway's uniqueness, in other words, artificial death. Presently, she was usurping, digesting, and wielding the corresponding authority. In other words, the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction's target of belief was, in a way, the Evernight goddess. After the authority was fully transferred and seized, they were bound to suffer a purge before slowly merging with the Church of Evernight. Or they might continue their work, making contact with the other Numinous Episcopate factions and other secret factions while unnoticeably cooperating with the Nighthawks. To Klein, this wasn't anything of importance. What was important was, that in an ancient text he found before, it mentioned, to artificially create death, a number of Numinous Episcopate members had to pray to the uniqueness daily, as though it was a true deity. It was an attempt to slowly awaken its sentience and allow it to come to life. Of course, this was only one part of the overall plan which wasn't critical. Then, could it be possible that when Palenque Tesiblius prayed to artificial death, he had mentioned Ince Zangwill's motives and had sought blessings? But he will probably never imagine that artificial death has already been controlled by the Evernight goddess. Although it hasn't become part of her manifestation, it has already lost its freedom. From this angle, directly setting up a ritual to pray to the goddess might allow one to obtain Ince Zangwill's motives. That's quite possible. The more Klein thought about it, the more certain he was that his seemingly ridiculous plan would succeed. And as for the reason why this could become a reality, it was because the enemy's leader was their spy. After getting Enzo to stop massaging him, Klein slowly got up and paced about, considering if he should make the attempt, and if so, how. Ince Zangwill is a traitor of the church. He's an insult to all Nighthawks. If there's a chance to wipe him out, the goddess should be very willing to see it happen. She wouldn't mind providing some help. But the goddess is now in a critical stage of seizing the artificial death's authority. She will not be able to provide answers for a long period of time, and she can only provide feedback to normal ritualistic magic. Besides, I also lack the corresponding materials. Also, I've been constantly warning myself to be on guard. I must not fully trust and rely on the goddess. On second thoughts, directly praying to her to obtain a revelation might not be too good. I hope to maintain a safe distance. Amidst his thoughts, Klein felt a little hesitant. He began letting his thoughts wander in a bid to find a more acceptable plan. Suddenly, he had a more ridiculous idea. Directly pray to artificial death. This actually posed no danger. This was because artificial death wasn't able to respond to prayers and rituals. If there was any feedback, it meant that it was essentially controlled by the Evernight goddess. On the other hand, Klein had the feather produced and left behind from the Artificial Death Project. He also had Azek's copper whistle. He didn't need to spend too much time to gather the ingredients needed to set up a ritual for a revelation. In addition, there's a layer in between us. I'm not directly contacting the goddess. Perhaps, this might even help her further seize Artificial Death's authority. Klein consoled himself as he began busying himself. He first used the sacrificial and bestowment ritual. He brought back the 2 remaining feathers and some full moon essence oil, night vanilla powder, and other items which he had not used in a while to the real world. Then, he modified the sacrificial altar and completed the first part of the preparations. After all, he was essentially praying to the Evernight goddess. He couldn't be bothered to head out to buy ritualistic materials of the death domain. This was essentially the same as other normal ritualistic magic. With great familiarity, Klein lit the candles, dripped some essential oils, and drew the symbols for human and concealment on an artificial goatskin. Then, in the thin fog that spread, he pressed Azek's copper whistle over it. Immediately after that, he placed the white feather stained with pale yellow oil stains inside the silver bowl that had burning herbal powder. He then watched it curl without any signs of it turning black. After exhaling silently, Klein took a step back and chanted in Hermes, "You are the essence of death. You are the Lord of the dead. You are the final home to all living beings. I pray for your help. I pray for you to tell me the motives for Zangwil's contact with the numinous episcopate." Just as he said those words, the 3 candlelight burgeoned as though they brightened significantly but were tainted with a dark green. The surroundings turned cold and creepy. Klein closed his eyes and entered cogitation for 30 seconds, feeling uneasy. He walked in front of the altar, picked up the full moon essence oil and dripped 1 drop onto each of the 3 candles. After doing this, he took away Azek's copper whistle, grabbed the artificial goatskin, and moved it close to the candlelight representing himself. When it ignited, he threw it into the silver bowl. With a whoosh, the white feather, which didn't show any signs of damage, soared with pale white flames, covering the entire silver bowl and obstructing Klein's vision. About 3 seconds later, the fire subsided, leaving a mound of powder in the silver bowl. The powder moved without the help of any wind, forming one word after another: possessed by an evil spirit. Requires exorcism. Chapter 932 Thin-skinned. The goddess really replied. Upon seeing the words formed by the powder, Klein's first reaction had nothing to do with the content. Instead, he was shocked that this seemingly ridiculous thing had happened. Although he was already mentally prepared and had believed that the chance of success was rather high, he still felt conflicting emotions. It took him almost a minute to accept it. After a while, Klein exhaled slowly, raised his right hand, and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise manner. Praise the lady. He then ended the ritual, forcing himself to focus his attention on the revelation itself. Possessed by an evil spirit. Requires exorcism. Zangwil actually got possessed by an evil spirit? He had gone from sequence 9 to sequence 5 of the death pathway. The godhood he obtained at the critical stage is also sequence 4 Nightwatcher of the Evernight pathway, one that is good at dealing with spirit body type creatures. Evil spirits and wraiths should be afraid of him, so why would he end up being possessed? That's unless the evil spirit's level is extremely high or, at its core, is very special. Unfortunately, I've only met one evil spirit in the truest sense of the word. It's that ancient evil spirit sealed in the underground ruins of Alista Tudor. I know little about such monsters, so it's difficult for me to grasp the details. I can write to ask Miss Sharon. I can also get little son to find out more. That shepherd elder Lovia had grazed an evil spirit. It's no wonder Zangwil is trying to meet a demigod of the numinous episcopate. When it comes to exorcising evil spirits, aside from the Church of Evernight and Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun, the best would probably be the numinous episcopate. There's probably the Church of the God of Combat as well. Neighboring pathways often have similar traits. There's also one point that can be gleaned from this. Ince Zangwill doesn't wish for his possessed state to be known by the royal family faction and the demonist sect who are in cahoots with him. Otherwise, there's no need for him to come all the way to the southern continent. The two factions existed before the fifth epoch, and they have a long legacy. It's quite unlikely that they don't have a sealed artifact that can remove or exorcise evil spirits. Even if they can't find one, getting the demonist sect to contact the numinous episcopate is definitely safer and more covert than getting Ince Zangwill to make the trip himself. As his thoughts raced, Klein unfolded a piece of paper and wrote, "The intel you have provided me made me connect certain clues from what I've previously gathered. And due to a particular great existence's help, this points to a clear conclusion. Ince Zangwill is possessed by an evil spirit, and he's seeking the numinous episcopate's help. Just based on this fact alone, we can make several useful judgments. Ince Zangwill will often manifest inconsistency in his words and actions. He will often deviate from his normal path, doing something we feel that is absolutely impossible for him to do, and to make mistakes we find incomprehensible. Before this problem is resolved, he will not stop having contact with the numinous episcopate. It might even become more frequent. Making investigations based on this might allow us to catch Ince Zangwill by the tail. However, I believe we still wouldn't be able to lock onto him. The creation of coincidences from that Grade O sealed artifact is insurmountable." Upon writing this, Klein couldn't help but recall his direct encounter with Ince Zangwill. His own investigations didn't directly point to him, but it caused their ploy to nearly fail. Hence, Ince Zangwill personally took action, sending a meteor falling from the sky in an attempt to kill Sherlock Moriarty so as to obliterate any clues. And he ultimately received Mr. Azek's help and escaped the dire situation, forcing Ince Zangwill to step into the limelight and expose himself. Back then, if Mr. Azek had recovered to his former strength, Ince Zangwill might already be dead. But to replicate such a situation and force him to appear before me is still extremely difficult. After all, back then, not only was there Mr. Azek, a death consul, and my use of the grey fog to foil the coincidences, there was also Trissy Cheek and the ring which was suspected to be a Grade O sealed artifact. Without her suddenly escaping, Ince Zangwill wouldn't have been forced to personally take action. Klein deliberated as he wrote, "If we can figure out the origins and primary goals of the evil spirit, there might be a chance of the situation having a favorable change." After writing the matters regarding Ince Zangwill, Klein's heart stirred. Just as he was about to mention something else, he stopped his pen after writing the first few letters. He raised his left hand and pinched his cheeks. He appeared to be in a serious dilemma and seemed a little embarrassed. After muttering silently a few times, Klein finally smoothly wrote the rest. "Even without that Grade O sealed artifact's help, Ince Zangwill is an enemy you and I are unable to face head-on. We need to make plenty of preparations. If you can provide me with some worms of time, I can use them to create high-level charms that can deal with demigods. It's called a fate siphon charm. It can swap the fates of yourself and the target for a short period of time." Putting down his fountain pen, Klein didn't take a second look as he quickly folded the letter and seriously sealed it in an envelope. He then took out the adventurer's harmonica and a gold coin before summoning Miss Messenger. He got her to take away the reply letter to Leonard Mitchell, but this time, it wasn't addressed to 7 Pinster Street. Instead, it was directly sent to Leonard's present address. With Leonard having just written the letter, Klein didn't believe that he had moved out of Rionette Tinker's detection range. After doing all of this, Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he shook his head slightly. Requesting the help of others is really a difficult task. It's even more so for someone as thin-skinned as me. He quickly retracted his attention and once again modified Enzo's and Ludwell's appearances. After all, they had been seen by Angel of Fate Ouroboros during their exploration of Calderon City. During this process, Klein suddenly had an idea. He planned on sending them above the grey fog and using the Spirit World Plunderer's true soul body for a disguise. The Spirit World Plunderer could make its soul avatars take the form of its true soul body, and it could also get them to disguise themselves as other Spirit World creatures. The Beyonder ingredient it left behind must have had such abilities. However, it would be difficult to use it with the poor effects and the huge negative side effects. However, this wasn't a problem for Klein, who possessed the mysterious space above the gray fog. After all, he didn't plan on using the Beyonder ingredient for actual combat. Doing some changes to his marionette didn't require too many smooth operations and great effects. Furthermore, this could be slowly adjusted. As for the negative effects that came from the godhood, it wasn't something to consider. Who wasn't obedient when left in the junk pile? After a series of tasks, Klein sat at the high back chair of the fool. In his hand was the palm-sized spirit world plunderer's true soul body. Without looking down to look at it in detail, he extended his spirituality bit by bit into it. There wasn't much changes to the scene before him. It was still the illusory and dense black spirit body threads. However, when he tried controlling them, he discovered that not only could he control the marionette spirit body threads, but he could also let his spirit body threads extend out and penetrate into their bodies. When both sides established such a two-way connection, Klein suddenly felt that he and his marionette was one. All his Beyonder powers could be enacted on the other party through the spirit body threads, including his trick for changing his appearance and body. Amidst a slow and difficult process, Klein felt rather groggy as he felt his emotions turned into a mess. He began showing signs of losing control. This was an inevitable outcome from having his spirituality make direct contact with godhood. He hurriedly diverted some attention to stir some of the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog, and he restored his condition back to its normal state. After enduring the torment, Klein finished his attempt. Enzo had transformed into a southern continent native that looked like he came from a plantation. Ludwell had a mixed blood feel to him. His ghastly face was no longer more bone than flesh. Instead, there was a plumpness to it. As for the silver mask that had the effect of placating the soul, there was no way of removing it for the time being. All Klein could do was let it stick to Ludwell's chest. This still had a certain level of effect, but it was inferior to wearing it on his face. It could barely maintain the status quo. Unfortunately, there's no way to change this mask into other types of accessories. Otherwise, it would save me quite a bit of trouble. As Klein rushed to throw the spirit world plunderer's true soul body back onto the junk pile, he rubbed his temples and allowed his thoughts to wander. Right, I still have a soul assurer Beyonder characteristic here that can be made into a mystical item to replace that mask. No, I've always planned on returning it to the church. I'll mail it to him when Leonard replies. After the discomfort slowly subsided, Klein took out his golden pocket watch and opened it to check the time. Following that, he summoned a paper figurine and stirred some of the powers of the mysterious space above the gray fog. He then threw both into a specially labeled point of light. It was the point of light representing the fool's only believer at present, Danitz. From Klein's point of view, Admiral of Stars Katlia had the Moses ascetic order backing her. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina was from the Church of Knowledge and Wisdom. Anderson Hood didn't know much about Gehrman Sparrow, and being good at identifying the situation he was in, he wasn't one to put on a brave front. Therefore, when the Aurora Order did an investigation, it was unlikely that they would be in grave danger. Danitz was the only exception. With him in West Balam and not able to return to the Golden Dream anytime soon, his lacking strength, and him often wearing the boxing glove that made him act rashly, it was truly worrisome. Due to this fact, Mr. Fool had to work a little harder. He gave Danitz a paper angel's embrace every day at a fixed time, so as to disrupt any divination or prophecies about him. Leonard never expected Klein Moretti to reply that quickly. With some level of incredulity, he opened the envelope and read the corresponding content. Due to a particular great existence's help. Is he referring to the fool? Indeed, Klein's investigations into Nsangwil has already reached a significant depth. He has already figured out the truth the moment I mentioned the numinous episcopate. Possessed by an evil spirit? How did he end up being possessed by an evil spirit? How do we make use of it? Worms of time. Leonard quickly scanned through the last part of the letter as his expression suddenly became complicated. In his mind, Palaz Zoroast maintained his silence without saying a word. Chapter 933 Evil Spirits Common Trait. After a while, Leonard cleared his throat and wore a smile without realizing it. He said with a suppressed voice, "Old man, Klein's. This suggestion seems pretty good. It's very, very viable. The effects should be quite substantial. Why don't you consider it? Didn't you mention that you would do your best to help me exact revenge?" I thought Worms of Time could only be used for avatars and act as support," he subconsciously droned on while Palaz Zoroast remained silent the entire time. Only after a while did he sigh lightly and say, "I can only give you a maximum of 2 Worms of Time." Without waiting for Leonard to say a word, he added, "To exact revenge on a demigod who wields a grade O sealed artifact, the most important thing is still your own level and strength. Otherwise, you won't have a chance of using it even if you have a high-level charm." Leonard wiped away his smile and nodded seriously. "I'll do my best digesting my potion. If you finish digesting it and fail to accumulate enough contribution points, I'll help you seek out the Beyonder ingredients needed for Spirit Warlock." As for only having 2 Worms of Time, he wasn't disappointed at all. It was already a bonus. Just getting 1 was a great boon. Having 2 meant that he and Klein could split it, each of them having 1 Fate Siphon charm. After expressing his attitude, he asked in puzzlement, "Old man, do you think Klein has already used the previous Worm of Time as a charm?" He remembered very clearly that, back when they were figuring out who Emlyn White was supporting, Old Man had parasitized Tinder with a Worm of Time. Later, it lost contact and failed to be of any use. Now, on retrospection, just Emlyn White's and Sherlock Moriarty's close relationship made it easy for him to figure out the truth. The Worm of Time had been eliminated by the upper echelons of the secret organization or even the Fool himself. Furthermore, there was a high chance that it had been bestowed to Klein. Otherwise, his former colleague wouldn't have known of the existence of the Worm of Time. Palaz Zoroast immediately scoffed. If he hasn't already used it and seen its effects, why would he raise the issue and ask for more? All right. I need to separate the Worms of Time. This will make me fall asleep for at least 2 weeks. If you have any questions, find someone to answer them by yourself." With that said, not giving Leonard a chance to raise further questions, he scattered his spirituality and created a blob of light that hung high inside Leonard's mind as though he didn't wish to speak. Leonard's instinctive response was to chuckle dryly. He focused his attention back onto the letter from Klein Moretti as he carefully read it again. Possessed by an evil spirit. The origins and primary goals of the evil spirit. I don't know much about evil spirits. Nothing comes to mind. After a few minutes of thought, Leonard took out a matchbox and burned the letter. Then, he left the room which the local Nighthawks had assigned him at the last minute. He came to a room diagonally opposite his and knocked on the door. Before long, Daly, who hadn't removed her blue eyeshadow and blush, opened the door and pricked up her eyebrows. When did a sleepless have the courage to knock on a lady's door at a time highly associated with a bed? Ahem. I have some questions I'd like to consult you about. Leonard obviously didn't dare respond to Daly's comment as he immediately expressed the reason why he was here. Daly sized him up and chuckled. I'm not responsible for counseling minors. As she spoke, she made way and allowed Leonard to enter her room. Without daring to let his eyes wander, he casually pulled a round stool to sit on. He then went straight to the point. Ma'am, I'd like to know more about evil spirits. You're a sequence 5 of the death pathway. You have higher clearance than me. You should know quite a lot. Why are you asking me this? Daly propped herself with her hands on the edge of the table behind her. Without waiting for him to reply, she continued, most evil spirits are the result of dead high-sequence Beyonders. A small number of them are wraiths who break through various restrictions by using various opportunities. The first situation is more common. After high-sequence Beyonders consume a potion to obtain godhood, their soul body would have experienced a mutation. It would be a mutation at their core. This allows their soul body to remain even in death or when their powers are dispersed. There will be a certain level of divinity to it, making them rather terrifying. the second situation isn't different on a fundamental level. Normally speaking, evil spirits will weaken with the passage of time until they completely dissipate. However, they can also assimilate into the region where they were born, making the spirit world and even the underworld fuse with it. They then extract power from this to maintain their existence. Therefore, many evil spirits have their own territory and active range. It's not that they do not wish to leave, but they can't. The only exception is when they accumulate sufficient power, allowing their existence to experience a fundamental change. Leonard habitually crossed his right leg over his left and pressed in thought. Can evil spirits leave their territory by possessing a person? Yes, but ordinary humans and most Beyonders are unable to withstand the extraction effect the evil spirits have on their bodies. They will quickly lose their spirituality and body temperature and be unable to last long. As Daly spoke, she raised her hand to point at herself. The best method is to rely on Beyonders of the death pathway. Of course, it has to be at least a sequence 5, because from Gatekeeper, we will have our own dead spirit prison in our bodies. It can be called a miniature underworld. It can provide an evil spirit with an adequate environment for their existence. Once you become a spirit warlock, you will also have similar powers. However, it will be more about sealing and sleeping than an internal underworld. Heh, those natural spirits and wraiths are truly troublesome when they come in and out. In Zangwill's sequence 5 is Gatekeeper. It's no wonder that the evil spirit can possess him for long periods of time. Or could it be that he failed at an attempt to enslave an evil spirit? Leonard's thoughts opened up as he immediately made connections. He deliberated for a few seconds before asking, what sort of needs does an evil spirit have? Needs? Singing? Dancing? Poetry? Men? Women? The sea of stars? Daly returned with a question, amused. Leonard realized that his usage of words was problematic as he awkwardly ruffled his hair. I mean, what desires will an evil spirit have? That depends on what it desired while it was alive. Typically speaking, the remnant spirit will inherit the original obsessions, without being able to balance it rationally. If it were you, that evil spirit might attempt to write poems, imprison a group of spectators, and seek acknowledgement. Or it will do things in an ostentatious manner like the protagonist of a play, Daly joked. However, regardless of what it was while it was alive, as long as one becomes an evil spirit, they commonly desire two things. What are they? Leonard turned attentive. Daly shot a glance at him and said, first, it's to feed on the souls of living creatures. This can pleasure them, an innate pleasure that stems from the need to maintain their existence. In addition, a large number of souls will allow them to escape the restrictions of their territory and active range. It will replace the power provided by the spirit world and underworld. Second, it's to seek out Beyonder ingredients from their pathway while they were alive. Through this, they could create another foundation. At a certain stage, the evil spirit would no longer need to draw on the powers of the spirit world and underworld. They would no longer be restricted by their territories or active range. In a sense, they would have transformed into a special spirit world creature. Leonard seemed to realize something as he thought. This also means that evil spirits can consume sequence potions? No, sequence potions are created for human consumption. They reduce the risk of losing control. To many supernatural creatures, there's no need to do so. They can directly consume the ingredient raw. It's especially so for evil spirits. Their obsession, cruelty, ferociousness, and penchant for souls make them half crazy to begin with. There's no need to regulate it from other sources. Furthermore, they are spirit bodies, so the method of consumption is direct accommodation and slow digestion. Daly corrected Leonard's point. To the evil spirit that possesses in Zangwill, whenever it has the upper hand, it will control the body to seek out Beyonder ingredients of its pathway while it was alive. Leonard was first surprised before he had an idea. He said in a pleasant surprise, I understand. Thank you for answering my questions. With that said, he hesitated for a few seconds and asked after some deliberation, Ma'am, I believe we shouldn't just figure out the motives behind Zangwill's meeting with the numinous episcopate demigod, but we also need to track his trajectory since Backlund to East Balam. We need to know what he did midway, what items he found. This might lead us to effective clues. Daly suddenly fell silent before she pricked up her brows and said, "Well said. But what does this have to do with evil spirits?" "Nothing. I raised the question so as to make preparations because I believe that since we are investigating the numinous episcopate, we might encounter evil spirits." The latter half was a suggestion I wished to make after the break. "I just wished to talk to you about it beforehand." Leonard's mind raced as he slowed down his speech and fabricated an excuse on the spot. Daly listened in silence and chuckled. "If you actually work so hard to fabricate stories in front of other girls, you'll no longer be single with those looks of yours. Unfortunately, I'm not a clueless girl." "All right, there's no need to explain further. Leave." Leonard stood up lamely without trying to emphasize his point. He then walked towards the door. Just as he gripped the handle, Daly's slightly ethereal voice sounded behind him. "I don't know what secret you're hiding, nor do I know what you know. None of that matters. But when it comes to Zangwill, if you need any help or aid, you can find me." Leonard paused for 2 seconds as his mouth quivered. He then pulled open the door and walked out. City of Silver. Derek Berg had received the order to join an expedition team. Leading it was Chief Colin Iliad. Their target was Noise City. It was in a northern city's ruins where the shapeshifter and other terrifying creatures lived. Chapter 934 1 + 1 greater than 2 Ever since the information about the suspected Bizarro Bane shapeshifter was given to Mr. World, Derek constantly believed that the latter might one day entrust him with a mission for the corresponding ingredients. However, his strength was lacking. Even with his friends, it was impossible for him to complete the hunt. Furthermore, such expeditions needed to go through the 6-member council. Private teams were unable to wander too far from the City of Silver. Therefore, all he could do was temporarily suppress it deep down. From time to time, it was used to motivate him to advance quicker. To his surprise, it didn't take long before an expedition team headed for Noise City was set up. Leading the team was Chief Colin Iliad. Combining his previous discussion with Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and company at the recent tarot gathering, Derek quickly came up with a theory. During the exploration of the former chief's mausoleum, Mr. Fool had provided a certain level of help to the present chief, allowing him to foil the fallen creator's ploy and successfully resolve certain matters. Hence, noticing his search for information, the demon hunter had decided to hunt a shapeshifter to please the deity. This is a necessary way to curry favor, and is also a kind of equivalent exchange. The Hanged Man's words resounded in Derek's mind. It made him no longer puzzled over the matter. So, taking the opportunity before he set out, he prayed to Mr. Fool and requested him to inform Mr. World of this expedition. He quickly received a response and heard Mr. World say, "If the hunting of the Bizarro Bane is difficult or dangerous, the requirements can be lowered. Attempt to extract its blood. As long as you obtain it, I'll trade for it with the Priest of Light's Beyonder characteristic." Priest of Light's Beyonder characteristics? Mr. World already has the Priest of Light Beyonder characteristic? Or could it be that he has locked onto a target and will quickly be able to obtain it? With the chief's strength and the teamwork of the expedition team, there's a high chance of success if it's just extracting the blood. Derek felt relieved as he held Thunder God's roar and left his residence, heading straight for the training field. Just as he arrived at his destination, he saw Chief Colin Iliad. The latter carried 2 swords on his back. He was tall and staid, leaving anyone who saw him at ease. And beside this demon hunter was another person. She was wearing a black robe with purple patterns, and she had long, curly, silver-gray hair. Shepherd Lovia. Lovia, who was apparently participating in this expedition, turned her head as her pale gray eyes reflected Derek Berg's figure. However, there was only calm in her eyes. Derek felt a baffling sense of alarm as he involuntarily slowed down his pace. East Balam, above the gray fog. Klein deeply approved of the City of Silver's chief's organization of an expedition to Noise City. He also informed Little Sun that there was no need to take risks. All he needed was some blood of the target for the completion of the mission. When the time came, he could smear the blood over Grozel's travels, bring all his gear, and challenge the Bizarro Bane on his turf, thus obtaining the Beyonder ingredients he needed. Klein had also considered the possibility of whether Grozel's travels' ability to swallow people into the book's world was screened by the uniqueness of the forsaken land of the gods. He had also come up with a solution. It was to bestow Little Sun with Grozel's travels. After achieving the goal, he could get Little Sun to sacrifice it back. In addition, he wasn't worried about the Bizarro Bane lacking blood because of its nature as a spirit world creature. This was because the Bizarro Sorcerer Potion formula clearly wrote, supplementary ingredients, 200 milliliters of a Bizarro Bane's blood. There are always more solutions than problems. Klein muttered in satisfaction before returning to the real world. Before sleeping, he received a reply from Leonard Mitchell. It mentioned that it would take another day for the Worm of Time, and he described the monsters known as evil spirits in detail. Another day before it can be provided. And there will be 2 of them. The grandpa in Leonard's body has quite a good attitude. Unable to leave the territory, limited in activity range. Their common trait is to devour the souls of living creatures and to desire Beyonder ingredients from their pathway from when they were still alive. This also means that the evil spirit will seek out the corresponding ingredients and Beyonder characteristics when it wields control over Zangwill's body. This is indeed a direction for investigation. Klein held the letter as he read and thought. Suddenly, he recalled something. Back when he encountered Zangwill on Waypoint Island in the Berserk Sea, the latter had been pursued by a powerful demigod from the Hunter pathway. Could it be a result of that evil spirit? I previously imagined that Zangwill had received a commission by some faction in the royal family, and did something that targeted the Intis Republic, only to have a mistake happen, thus exposing himself and getting pursued by their powerhouses. From the looks of it, there might be another possibility. That evil spirit desires the Beyonder characteristics of the Hunter pathway, and when it could control Zangwill's body, it attempted to hunt Beyonders of the same pathway. This might have succeeded or failed. In short, the result was that he was targeted by a powerful demigod from the Hunter pathway. He pursued him the entire journey with his intuition as a hunter. The more Klein thought about it, the more convinced he was that his theory was close to reality. This was the only way to explain why Zangwill, who wielded 0-08, was discovered. At this moment, Enzo and Ludwell were kneeling down, massaging Klein's legs. I can guess that it's an evil spirit of the Hunter pathway for now. I'll later write back to Leonard and get him to steer the investigations in this direction. This fellow's acting isn't that great, nor does he have the psychological experience. I wonder if he will end up exposing himself. Perhaps, he will explain it away with some non-existent informant. Hunter pathway evil spirit. Hunter pathway evil spirit. Klein's eyes suddenly widened as he suddenly sat up, leaving his 2 marionettes at a loss. There weren't many evil spirits he knew, and he had only seen one. However, that one happened to be from the Hunter pathway. It was Red Angel Medici's main body that had combined with the remnant psyches of the 2 sequence 1 angel from the Sauron and Einhorn families. When it came to the Hunter pathway, there was no evil spirit that was of an even higher level. That was unless Blood Emperor Alista Tudor still had his psyche remaining. Previously, Zangwill was in Backlund. That evil spirit, who I'm not sure if I should call Medici, was also in Backlund. Later, that evil spirit escaped the seal, and its whereabouts are unknown. As for Zangwill, he suffered from the possession of an evil spirit. Both sides are evil spirits from the Hunter pathway. Could the one possessing Zangwill be the Red Angel evil spirit? Klein frowned bit by bit, almost finding his theory unbelievable. However, he found it very possible. As his thoughts raced, he found another indirect piece of evidence. The unique trait of 0-08 is that once you know it, it will also know you. And as a king of angels who survived from the second epoch, Red Angel Medici probably knows all kinds of details about 0-08. In other words, as long as the evil spirit attempted to recall anything related to 0-08, 0-08 would know of it and establish a connection. Right, there was that sentence, pleasure working with you, no way. But the problem lies in the fact that I previously suspected that evil spirit to have one sequence, one characteristic. There's no need for it to seek any more of it. Could it be that it hasn't digested it? Klein rubbed his temples as his head ached. He stood up, entered his bathroom, and took 4 steps counterclockwise and headed above the gray fog. Just as he sat down, he conjured a pen and paper and wrote the following divination statement. The one possessing Intzangwil is the evil spirit back in the underground ruins of Alista Tudor. He scrutinized each word for a few seconds before taking off the topaz pendant on his left wrist and planned to use spirit dowsing for the divination. This time, the scene he saw when he opened his eyes was, the topaz pendant stood still. This meant that the divination had failed. The level is too high and there's 0-08. Right, that evil spirit also carried the red priest card that has anti-divination and anti-prophecy properties. It's no wonder I failed with the 3 combined. This is also an indirect confirmation. Klein analyzed the reason and considered what other ways he could make a verification. He tapped his finger on the edge of the long bronze table and silently muttered to himself, apart from getting Leonard to lead the Red Gloves to do an investigation, I should do something as well. Assuming that the one possessing Intzangwil is really the Red Angel evil spirit, where will it seek out Beyonder ingredients from the Hunter pathway when it gains control of the body? Intis's capital, Trier? Faceac capital, St. Millum? Or would it solely rely on the card of blasphemy's activation and seal in order to use the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence to attract Beyonders to fly to it like moths flying to a fire? Wait, it mentioned before that the descendants of the Medici family are in Bansi Harbor. Although it has already been destroyed, there might still be something buried there. Also, the evil spirit with the 3 angels remnant spirit has very potent provocative traits. This matches Leonard's description of evil spirits in the letter. It might have deliberately left something in Bansi. With this in mind, Klein immediately conjured the World Gehrman Sparrow's figure and requested the hanged man to head to Bansi once more to do a more thorough investigation. After doing that, Klein began contemplating. Once he confirmed that Intzangwil had the Red Angel evil spirit in him, he wondered if he could use the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence as a starting point, enticing Intzangwil into the trap he set up using the corresponding ingredients. Hunter pathway. Hunter pathway. Amidst his thoughts, Klein suddenly recalled 2 hunters who were loitering in West Balam. He frowned slightly and began analyzing. Although East Balam and West Balam are vast territories, and the distance between the city that Intzangwil made his last appearance and the northern state is very great, he will probably take nearly half a month to travel, even as a demigod since he doesn't have teleport. In theory, Danitz and Anderson will not suddenly encounter the Red Angel evil spirit because of the law of convergence. Also, their sequences are too low, but I can't be too sure. West Balam, Northern State, Kukoa City. Danitz shot a glance at Anderson and blurted out. I'm going to do some investigations. Why are you following me? Logically speaking, shouldn't you head back to the Fog Sea at Barons Harbor? Chapter 935 Meeting Up. Anderson, who was enjoying a piece of cream cassava bread, looked up at Danitz. Seemingly in thought, he said, I'm not sure why, but I don't wish to leave West Balam. Haha. Since I'm here, as a treasure hunter, how can I return empty-handed? In the extensive forests, there are all sorts of abandoned temples that have gold, jewelry, antiques, and maybe mystical items. All of them are waiting for me to rescue them. Danitz tipped his chin and guzzled down the remaining water. This was a beverage made from a fruit native to West Balam. It was orange-yellow in color with a sweetness amidst its sourness. It was good at quenching thirst and relieving heat. It also had some caffeine that allowed people to combat fatigue and stay awake. Putting down the cup and picking up his napkin to wipe his mouth, Danitz scoffed. I keep feeling as though you're up to something. I also hope that's the case, Anderson said with an unconcerned smile. He matched breakfast with coffee. In East and West Balam, there were many excellent coffee-bearing lands. They were just slightly less famous than Fainapotter's Highlander coffee, the Southern Continent's Highlander coffee, and the Star Highlands and the nearby Paws Valley's Fermo coffee. Without waiting for Dannett's reply, Anderson said with a smile, "Actually, isn't this good? I'm providing you with free protection, and you're my interpreter. Everyone benefits out of this arrangement." Recalling that he was only a Sequence 7 and was wanted by all kinds of factions, Dannetz had a baffling feeling that Anderson's words made sense. He coughed slightly and said, "But there will be certain times when I'll get you to stay away." "If you say, please, then there's no problem," Anderson said in a relaxed manner. Dannetz immediately hooded himself and walked towards the hotel's exit in preparation to begin today's investigations. Midway, he suddenly said, "Have you had such an experience? Often dreaming of an angel's descent, wrapping you in its layered wings?" "No, it's not only a dream. I occasionally will have the same hallucination even when I'm awake." Anderson glanced at the boxing glove Dannetz was wearing. After pondering for a few seconds, he said with a smile, "Are you a believer of some secret existence? Or have you made contact with some ancient item?" Dannetz's expression froze as he forced a smile. "If it were as simple as you said, I would have long guessed the reason." As he spoke, he brushed shoulders with the three men who came in before walking out. Anderson habitually sized up the passers-by to confirm his surroundings. Therefore, he glanced at the three men and realized that they were a master and two servants. The master was tall and his skin was brown. He had soft facial features, as though he had parents from Balam and Lone. He wore attire in the style of the Northern Continent: silk top hat, black formal suit, and a gold inlaid cane. The two servants were standard locals that seemed to come from plantations. They were helping their master hold his cane and leather suitcase. One of them was a mixed blood with a fleshy face and baggy clothes. On his waist was a rapier, as though he was also playing the role of a bodyguard. Unconcerned, Anderson retracted his gaze and followed Dannetz onto the street. He pointed at the different styled coffins that were horse-drawn or manually lifted with piqued interest. "Want to try one of those? It's very interesting. Once you get used to it, you will realize that death isn't something to be afraid of. Perhaps you might be able to open the lid at some point in time and stand up again." Dannetz looked at the strange transportation tool through the corner of his eyes as he didn't hesitate to shake his head. "As a pirate, I more or less believe in the Lord of Storms. Certain things are taboo, and one of them is to stay away from coffins. I'm different. I don't have any taboos." Anderson casually took out a few Delexi and bought a few sets of newspapers from the paperboy on the street. It had to be said that when it came to paperboys, the various cities in the Southern Continent weren't inferior to the Northern Continent. After all, manual labor was cheaper, and there were many children who needed to supplement their family's income. As Dannetz walked to the end of the street in search of a carriage meant for foreigners, he took a copy of the newspapers from Anderson and quickly browsed through it. Suddenly, he noticed a piece of news: infamous pirate who calls himself Admiral Hell, Ludwell, has been killed by the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow. His Black Tulip and entire crew has been taken over by Mirella, who claims to be Death's envoy. This, Dannetz's mouth turned slightly agape, and he was hardly able to close it. He finally understood why Gehrman Sparrow wanted him to be careful of the numinous episcopate. This lunatic had actually killed the strongest of the 7 pirate admirals, Ludwell. About 10 seconds later, Dannetz handed the newspapers to Anderson with a dazed expression. "Take a look at this." Anderson received the newspaper with a smile and quickly scanned through it. After a brief silence, he whistled and chuckled. "That fellow likely has a new nickname, Pirate Admiral Nemesis." Dannetz didn't dare to nod as he poignantly said, "Back when I first met him, although I already found him terrifying, I never expected him to be this terrifying." At this moment, he recalled his early attempts of recruiting Gehrman Sparrow as a sailor of the Golden Dream. And while they left the hotel, Klein had already taken up residence in a luxurious room. He was standing by the window, watching the two hunters who were being flippant while walking. Rubbing the cufflink on his sleeves, he unfolded the letter and wrote, "I suspect that the evil spirit that possesses Zangwil is from the Hunter pathway. You can carry out more investigations in this regard." Along with this letter is a soul assurer's Beyonder characteristic. It comes from a pitiful person who was grazed. I liberated him and promised to return his characteristic to the Church of Evernight. In East Balam, having just prepared to join the morning meeting, Leonard suddenly saw the angel messenger who wielded 4 blonde, red-eyed heads appear before him. Already used to this, he received the letter and opened it and gave it a glance. He was surprised to see an item as resplendent as the night sky. This is... Leonard had an inkling as to what the item was. He hurriedly unfolded the letter and read it. 20 seconds later, he slowly sighed and silently said, "As expected, it's a Beyonder characteristic. Klein is still very friendly to the Church and the Nighthawks." He was rather delighted as he took out 2 transparent dead, ringed worms and placed it in that envelope. He then summoned Gehrman Sparrow's messenger, handed it to her, and paid the 1 gold coin. After doing this, Leonard loosened the top buttons of his shirt, walked out the room, and headed underground. On the way, he encountered Daly Simone. Still dressed as a spirit medium, Daly looked forward and asked very normally, "Any new clues?" "It's suspected to be an evil spirit of the Hunter pathway." Leonard fell silent for 2 seconds before he decided against concealing the matter. Daly nodded indiscernibly and said after some thought, "Then it might have the instinct of being provocative. It will proactively leave clues for us. Of course, this might also contain some level of misdirection to it." Knock. 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 Someone knocked at the captain's cabin of the Blue Avenger. "Come on in." Alger put down the brass sextant in his hand and said in a deep voice. A sailor opened the door and looked back. With the urging of his companions, he hesitantly entered the room and struck his left breast with his right fist and bowed. "Holy Lord of Storms." After Alger did the same response, he forced a smile and said, "Captain, many pirates and sailors from merchant ships have been recently saying that they found valuable items in the ruins of Bansi Harbor. There was even gold. We don't have any particularly important missions recently, so everyone is wondering if we should make another trip to Bansi. Such a bustling harbor, even if it has been searched numerous times, it should still have plenty of things left." Alger listened with a deadpan expression. After a few seconds of thought, he said, "I can understand your feelings. Let's do this. Let's head in the direction of Bansi Harbor, but do not set a destination. If nothing happens midway, we will stay there for a day." Aye, Captain." The sailor excitedly clenched his right fist and struck his left breast again. "May the storm be with you, may the storm be with you." Alger watched as his subordinate left and closed the door. Then, as though nothing had happened, he poured himself a cup of Lanty proof without any joy or anger as he sipped it slowly. Whatever that had just happened was within his expectations. This was because the news of finding items of value in Bansi Harbor's ruins was something he had spread while disguised. As a captain of the Church of Storms, he was constantly monitored by his sailors. Having been to Bansi once, mentioning it again made it suspicious. Therefore, Alger decided on getting the crew to make the request themselves. That way, even if they discovered anything or encountered something at Bansi Harbor, no one would suspect him, the captain. To the sailors, especially sailors who had just spent all their money in Biyao, any news or rumors with sufficient allure would stir their hearts the most. Alger knew this very well. In addition, the Blue Avenger had stayed in Biyao for too long. If he hadn't set sail, it would also be suspicious. As for monitoring artisan Sealth, it was naturally left to the hermit Catlia. Due to the investigations of the Aurora Order, this pirate admiral and the future had recently been hanging around the Rorstad archipelago. It was said to be an important base of the Moses ascetic order. After drinking the liquor, Alger put down his cup and looked out at the undulating waves and silently said a word, Bansi. Considering how it was late June, and while Septon's birthday was still unclear, Klein did some reorganization before heading above the gray fog to bring the radio transceiver back to the real world. He also warned himself that he could only ask a maximum of 2 questions. In the room that suddenly turned gloomy and cold, the unmanned transceiver began producing clicking voices. Chapter 936. Don't want to miss out. Amidst the clacking sounds, a white piece of illusory paper spewed out from the radio transceiver. On it were words composed of Loanese: "Exalted Great Master, your puny, loyal, and humble servant, Rhodes, is here to answer your summoning. Did you know? Dr. Aaron Sirius's child was born the night before the last. Thankfully I contacted the magic mirror in time." Klein nodded slightly and said, "Now I know." Amidst clacking sounds, more of the illusory white paper spewed out. "Based on the principle of reciprocity, it's your turn to ask a question." Klein had originally wanted to ask about matters regarding Insanguil, 0-08 and the Red Angel evil spirit, but considering how he had failed divining it above the gray fog, it was almost certain that Rhodes was unable to see it. At best, it could provide him more detailed information regarding 0-08, but this way, without the gray fog screening, it would be equivalent to him knowing of 0-08, and it would result in it knowing him. It didn't benefit him when it came to hiding behind the scenes to direct a play. After thinking for 2 seconds, he asked, "What means are there to speed up the digestion of potions? Do a better job acting." On the illusory white paper, black words were produced. Upon seeing the magic mirror's reply, Klein first fell silent before he slowly exhaled. For the present Insanguil's appearance was too early. He still needed about 2 months to completely digest the marionettist potion. When that happened, and with him already gathering the ingredients, he could orchestrate an assassination of the demigod, Insanguil, placing the sequence advancement with his wish together. Then there was no need for him to consider any room for retreat. However, Insanguil wouldn't appear until he was done preparing everything. He wouldn't follow the steps that Klein had in mind. Based on Klein's earliest ideas, it was to first gather information, figure out where Insanguil was, and wait until it was late August or early September before confirming the plan based on the situation. If not for the possession of the evil spirit, Insanguil wouldn't have exposed himself. If he didn't use Insanguil's current condition, it was very possible that he couldn't find the ladder again once he exorcised the evil spirit. Coincidences would stand in his way when it came to meeting him. Furthermore, if that were really the Red Angel evil spirit, Klein was also worried that Insanguil might have already died by the time he and Leonard started exacting revenge. The reason behind his death could be due to certain machinations, or from some ridiculously comedic situations, and not because of his sins. Due to these considerations, Klein attempted to digest his potion faster, hoping that he could complete it within a week or 2. However, Rhodes's answer left him depressed. He also knew that this wasn't something he could force. In 2 weeks, or even in the next few days, how was he to create a better opportunity to act? In his silence, Klein had already made up his mind. He didn't plan on tying the two matters together, and from the beginning, he wanted revenge against Insanguil as his primary goal provided there was a chance of success. He didn't wish to miss this opportunity. Although it had only been about 10 months, less than a year since the incident at the Blackthorn Security Company, it felt like a very, very long time, so long that he didn't wish to wait any longer. Catching a glance at the gloomy radio transceiver, Klein thought before wearing a stern look, he asked with a deep voice, "Back when I used the Winner marionette to look at myself, I learned why Beyonders of the Fate pathway will have such a reaction when facing me. Now, I would like to know what you see when you look at me." This question was a bolt out of the blue that seemed to echo in the room. The radio transceiver suddenly fell silent, and the clacking sound sounded after quite a while. A black illusory piece of paper spewed out, and on it were ghastly white words, I see support and dominance from you. Are you satisfied with such a question? Support, dominance. What does that mean? Klein had planned on pressing on, but he believed that Rhodes was unlikely to explain it too clearly because it lacked the required knowledge. Realizing that the mother tree of desire was about to find him if he kept this up, he nodded and said, "Acceptable. That shall be all for today. You may return." The clacking of the radio transceiver became increasingly brisker as the paper that appeared was white again. "All right, Great Master, goodbye your loyal and humble servant, a Rhodes, is constantly at your service. This time, the magic mirror seemed to forget to add a hand-waving drawing. That was quite a quick escape. Klein mumbled and immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered above the grey fog. He conjured the world Gehrman sparrow and informed the hermit Catlia that the mythical creature blood she needed was ready. She was to provide the means to regain a certain amount of strength during one's weak stages as quickly as possible. Before long, Catlia set up a ritual and sacrificed an item to the fool and requested this mighty existence to hand it to the world and tell him that the principle of the item's effect was to temporarily borrow a portion of one's strength from their former self. This sounds familiar. It sounds like the powers of the Seer Pathways Sequence 3 Scholar of Yore. The fool Klein was surprised as he picked up the item that Mam Hermit had sacrificed. It was like the end of a cane with a long transparent gem embedded on it. It was carved with complicated, mysterious, indescribable, 3-dimensional symbols and magic labels. Klein recognized 2 of them. One was the incomplete pupilless eye, and the other was the incomplete contorted lines. Could this be an item that really points towards Sequence O the Fool? But isn't it a little too complicated? This cane feels really familiar. It's like the crystal ball little son had used when he prayed to me. See, could it also correspond to another crimson star? Klein looked out the ancient palace with an odd expression, but all he saw were illusory stars suspended in the infinite grey fog without any signs of abnormality. With the fact that such items were one-use items like charms, he abandoned the idea of experimenting with it. All he could do was summon some paper from the junk pile and seriously record down the complicated and abnormal symbols and magic labels on the cane. Lone Kingdom, Backlund, Dr. Aaron's residence. A maid was inside the master bedroom, taking care of a soundly sleeping infant. Downstairs, the banquet which had many guests attending had reached the midway mark. Suddenly, in a corner, 3 figures quickly materialized. Leading them was a man in a silk top hat, black formal suit. He was none other than Klein Moretti, who hadn't disguised himself. He tossed out a charm and muttered an ancient Hermes term, crimson. The dark red flames flashed, and amidst a light explosion sound, soothing powers emanated out. The maid fell asleep instantly, collapsing onto the bedside into a deep sleep. Klein made his 2 marionettes stand in their spots as he walked to the infant's cot and cast his gaze inside. It was a child wrapped in silver silk. His skin was very fair, and he was fleshy with layer after layers. This infant showed no fear towards the stranger as he looked straight at Klein with his eyes wide open while sucking his fingers. Ahem. Klein couldn't help but smile as he took off his hat and bowed. Congratulations on being born. You should say that to my parents. The infant pulled out his fingers and spoke with a bright voice that didn't match his age. Klein chuckled and didn't harp on this meaningless topic with the snake of fate. He went straight to the point. I brought the method that allows you to regain a certain amount of strength during your weak stages. You can now give me that drop of placenta blood. Wuxia Septon opened up his fleshy palms and said, let me take a look first. How do you know that the method is an item? Klein couldn't help but ask in puzzlement. Wuxia Septon scoffed. An intuition of fate. It's like you didn't say a thing. Klein moved the cane from behind him forward and handed it over. The infant held it tightly and glanced at it twice before raising its voice. This can only be used once. That's right. Only once. Is that a problem? Klein deliberated and said, with your level and abilities, you can completely replicate the symbols and magic labels engraved on it, and then prepare the corresponding ingredients to hold the correct ritual. Wouldn't that allow you to use it multiple times? Wuxia Septon suddenly cut him off. All right, I accept it. Remember, you were the one who suggested it. Klein was momentarily a little dumbfounded, but he also seemed to realize something. He had a vague feeling that, despite him being here to take advantage of a baby, it ended up as the baby taking advantage of him. Yes, I was the one who suggested it. He finally drew a breath and nodded earnestly. The baby's plump face revealed a smile as he spread open his other hand. I've already prepared it for you. A total of 2 drops. 1 drop is for the transaction, and the other drop is your commission for facilitating this transaction. There's a commission? Klein was delighted as he hurriedly looked at Wuxia Septon's palm. There were 2 drops of silver blood there. Each drop appeared to have countless, illusory wheels spinning. They formed a belt that had its head connected to its tail. Just one look at it made Klein seem to lose his ability to think. He felt all his thoughts repeatedly appearing in his mind. He hurriedly shook his head and took out the iron cigar case which contained Azek's copper whistle. He then placed the 2 drops of snake of fate blood, which had clearly been sealed, inside. Thank you for your generosity, Klein said sincerely before asking, can this be used to make a charm? The baby sucked his fingers and said, of course. As for the exact symbols needed to be carved, you have already seen those. You are free to choose a combination. Whatever you get will all depend on your luck. Klein nodded and asked again, who should I pray to? You're probably unable to respond to relatively high-level rituals for the time being. And praying to Ouroboros is bordering on being a provocation. Do I pray to a sequence 2 angel of the fate pathway? But I don't know their honorific names. Wuxia Septon immediately grinned. There's a more convenient method. Who? Klein pressed in delight. The baby replied with a giggle, Empress of Misfortune and Horror. Chapter 937 Several days later Empress of Misfortune and Horror. Isn't that the goddess? That's right, misfortune includes bad luck, a part of fate. The goddess has the corresponding authority and can naturally give a response. By giving this suggestion, doesn't it mean that, in Wuxia Septon's eyes, he has always suspected that I'm Evernights blessed, it's just that I didn't notice it myself. It's the same as the answer I received about how I should get the high-sequence Beyonder potion formula of the seer pathway. He is even more certain after what happened at St. Samuel Cathedral. Klein was first taken aback before he became enlightened. As though he was muttering to himself, he said, if I were to pray to the goddess, no matter what symbols I choose, the final product's effect will likely be inclined towards the domain of bad luck. That's common sense, the baby wrapped in silver silk shouted. After obtaining confirmation, Klein felt more certain as he said with a smile, Are you still named Wuxia Septon? He was very curious if he changed his name after being born. If you like it, you can continue thinking so. However, my full name has already been changed to Wuxia, the baby replied indifferently. Klein thought before asking, if I want to deal with the wielder of 0-08, what suggestions do you have? I don't want to know about 0-08. I just wish to know if you have any suggestions. The plump baby looked at him as he suddenly opened his mouth and let out a loud cry. Wah! The corners of Klein's lips quivered. Upon seeing the maid about to wake up, he took a few steps back and vanished from the room with his 2 marionettes. Rorsted Sea. On the future which was docked in the Biyao Resistance's private harbor. Katlia, who was holding a ritual, saw a drop of silver blood fly out of the illusory door that manifested itself from the candlelight. With just one glance at it, she hurriedly closed her eyes, despite wearing her heavy glasses. At that instant, it felt like an aloof and mysterious wheel was spinning in a circle, forming a silver snake that had its head connected to its tail. This made her repeat her previous thoughts as she thanked Mr. Fool 12 consecutive times before returning to normal. It really is the blood of a mythical creature from the fate domain, and its level is higher than an ordinary angel. Katlia ended the ritual in delight, and she took out a container she had prepared ahead of time, placing the drop of silver blood inside. After obtaining some information on the monster pathway from Queen Mystic, and learning the existence of Angel of Fate Ouroboros from Mr. Fool, she quickly came up with a guess as to who the blood belonged to. Perhaps it's the one from the life school of thought. Or there might be another sequence 1 angel. Regardless, Mr. Fool is able to use at least 2 angels in the real world. Along with that ancient bane that I can't be certain of, aside from the lack of sealed artifacts, the faction that believes in Mr. Fool is enough to match that of Orthodox churches. Even the element dawn and Moses' ascetic order can't compare. As expected of an awakening ancient god. Increasingly filled with awe, Katlia drew a gasp and began considering her matters. Her other preparations were rather smooth sailing. Without any accidents, all she needed was to wait a month or so to attempt advancing to sequence 4 to obtain godhood. Overcast with heavy, black clouds, silver lightning would occasionally streak across the sky, illuminating the desolate plains and the winding rivers that ran dry. And in the middle of the plains, where the river made a half-circle, black, stacked shadowy outlines loomed. It was a lifeless city. After several days of traveling, the team led by the chief of the City of Silver's 6-member council, demon hunter Colin Iliad, finally arrived at their destination Noise City. The team was a small one. Excluding Colin, there were only 4 other members. They were the 6-member council elder, Shepherd Lovia, 2 Sequence 5 guardians, Leger and Gonlin, as well as Sequence 6 notary, Derek Berg. The overall strength of the team wasn't weaker than a complete expedition team, it was perhaps even stronger. According to Colin Iliad, this was because Noise City was filled with monsters, making it very dangerous. Shapeshifters were adept at disguises, and they enjoyed making use of the trust between teammates. Therefore, the smaller the expedition team, the better. And since there were fewer people, there was undoubtedly a need to prepare it with a stronger team. Was as they watched the city in front of them, which was covered in mist, one that couldn't be lit up despite the lightning, demon hunter Colin drew the 2 swords on his back. Unhurriedly, he slathered a silver-gray ointment on one, and a golden liquid on the other. He then stabbed the 2 swords in front of him. He then removed 3 small metal bottles from a hidden compartment on his belt, pulled out the stopper, and gulped the contents of the potion. Meanwhile, Leger and Gonlin had made preparations for combat. Derek Berg held his hammer with one hand as he opened up his other palm. With a solemn tone, he said in Jotun, "God says it's effective." Silently, Colin Iliad and company felt that the consumed potion, the conjured dawn, and the slathered ointment had been significantly augmented. Right on the heels of that, concentric rings of warm light emanated out, endowing the expedition team with courage and strength. After Derek used Holy Oath to boost his agility, Colin shot a glance at Lovia, who was holding an animal hide lantern and standing silently observing. He then turned his head to point at the perimeter of Noise City, which was more than 10 meters away. He said to the teenager, who was once again a little taller, "Use your ability to light up the streets ahead." After saying that, he surveyed his surroundings and added, "Once we enter Noise City, make sure we do not separate." A few days ago, I had already introduced the more active monsters that hide away in the darkness in this region. All of you should be aware of how separating will be utilized by the shapeshifter. Gonlin was a beautiful, female warrior who was 4 to 2, 5 meters tall. Upon hearing that, she thought and asked, "Then, should we make use of this to hunt the shapeshifter?" "It's best that we do not do so. It's just too dangerous. Also, it's very easy to end up killing our own teammates or end up becoming lost in Noise City forever," the grizzled Colin Iliad seriously warned. Derek looked at the silent city that was cloaked in thin mist as he subconsciously asked, "Your Excellency, was this city also under the giant king's court?" "Yes, but it's very close to a kingdom ruled by another ancient god," Colin answered patiently. Holding 2 iron black poles, the 2-4-meter tall Leger pressed with intrigue, "Which ancient god?" "King of demonic wolves, the Annihilator, Phlegria." "Is that so?" Derek remembered the chief's introduction, took a step forward, and extended his arms. Pure, radiant sunlight emitted from his body, illuminating the either collapsed or rotting buildings, the grayish-white stone-paved streets, and the extremely silent city perimeter. Derek and company saw figures appear on the streets. They were either wearing linen robes or animal hides, as though they were busily going on about their day. Upon sensing the sunlight's illumination, they silently turned their heads in unison and looked at the City of Silver expedition team. Bansi Harbor at night would occasionally have ravens or other birds calling out. It accentuated the gloom and deathly silence of the ruins. Even the sounds of crashing waves were unable to wash away that feeling as believers of the Lord of Storms and crew members of the Blue Avenger. the sailors were bold, especially when they believed that there might be gold or valuables hidden within the collapsed buildings. It spurred them on, sapping away any fear that might exist. The moment they arrived, they rushed down the ship and began searching the area in groups of 2 or 3. Alger didn't follow them as he strolled through the ruins alone, in search of any marks that appeared after Bansi Harbor's destruction. As he walked, with him wearing the Whip of Mind ring and having the blade of poison slung by his waist, he came to a collapsed building with crumbling walls and a door that was only a few pieces of charred wood. If I remember correctly, this was the telegraph office of Bansi Harbor. Alger nodded slightly as he approached and did a slight inspection. He then saw a relatively empty area amidst the rubble. The ground was parched black with 2 blood-red silhouettes. It was as though 2 people had been lying there, only to be squashed flat. And this had been months ago, yet, the 2 streaks of blood remained fresh, as though they still contained some degree of vitality to it. Alger's forehead throbbed as he felt as though he could imagine the vileness before Bansi Harbor was destroyed. He swept his gaze and suddenly saw a picture engraved on a crumbling wall beside the 2 blood-colored figures. It was a spot that the moonlight could hardly shine onto. The picture was very simple, and it wasn't even colored. It was of an armored monster with a squid's head that wielded a trident. Lightning swirled around it as waves surged at its feet. Behind it was a cape formed by bird feathers. Alger's eyes widened suddenly as he felt a tumultuous storm rage within him. He recognized who the monster was representing because the sun had once depicted it before. It was the warped version of the Lord of Storms according to Rose Redemption. And could this picture's appearance implied that a Rose Redemption member had previously come to Bansi Harbor, and they had drawn this picture after the building collapsed? Otherwise, it was impossible for the mural to not be damaged. It happened to fill an abnormal, crumbling wall. This should be what the world wanted me to find in Bansi Harbor. He's pursuing Rose Redemption? Alger muttered silently to himself as he raised his right hand. He had planned on destroying the picture, but after some thought, he retracted his arm, circling around Bansi Harbor's former telegraph office as though he hadn't discovered anything. He then walked in another direction. Chapter 938 Riding above the endless grey fog, in the magnificent and ancient palace. The warped picture of the Lord of Storms, one that's suspected to be left behind by a Rose Redemption member. Red Angel Medici is one of the founders of Rose Redemption. Klein sat in the high-back chair belonging to the fool as he silently looked at the crimson star representing the hanged man. Using his feedback, he had basically confirmed that the one possessing Ince Zangwil was the Red Angel evil spirit. In the eternal silence, Klein silently sat at the seat of honor of the model table as though he had become a deity statue. After an unknown period of time, he nodded indiscernibly and slowly exhaled. His figure vanished and returned to the real world. He continued his nap without thinking of any plans or considering anything related to Ince Zangwil. He slept till the next morning and got out of bed. He repeated his habits over the past few days, walking to the window barefooted and drawing the windows. On the streets outside the hotel, Danitz, who had dressed up like a West Balam native with an extra hooded cloak, held his iron-black boxing glove close to his chest before rushing to the square on his right. Based on his previous report, Klein knew that he was meeting one of the local ruling factions today to understand their stance on the arms deal. Anderson didn't follow. He had ruffled his parted short blonde hair in a mess as he leisurely strolled around the perimeter of the square, sat down, and wore a funny-looking puppet over his left black-gloved hand and began putting on a ventriloquist act for the people who walked by. The man and puppet each had different voices as they mocked each other with witty remarks. It was quite good at attracting attention. The only problem was that it was done in the Intis language and not Dudanese. Few people understood it, so after standing around to watch for a moment, they walked off. Klein focused on the Fog Sea's strongest hunter with the same expression as before. His eyes betrayed how deep in thought he was. East Balam, in the temporary office for Soist's Red Gloves. Cindy, who had long, wine-red hair, walked in with a few telegrams as she said excitedly, "New clues." "What clues?" Soest put down the white porcelain coffee mug in his hand as Leonard and Daly cast their gazes to the door. As Cindy handed the telegram to her captain, she said, Emperor Roselle's quote, "Wherever he steps, whatever he touches, whatever he leaves, even unconsciously, will serve as a silent witness against him," really makes sense. We've found people witnessing in Zangwill in several places, forming a complete trajectory. From this, we've realized that Zangwill's thoughts seem to be contradictory. He often approaches the colonies of Intis, staying for a short moment, before leaving it. He then approaches it once again and leaves it repeatedly as though. Isn't this what Klein mentioned? That his actions are inconsistent? Leonard was delighted as he offered a better description for Cindy, as though he's oscillating. Yes, oscillating. Cindy heaved a sigh of relief and began describing the findings. In addition, Zangwill has killed a few Intis military spies and has purchased several Beyonder ingredients. It's unknown what he's trying to do. This. Leonard deliberated and said, which pathways Beyonder ingredients are being bought by Zangwill? They are from the warrior, hunter, and bard pathways. Cindy pointed at the few telegrams that Captain Soest was reading. Indeed, there's the hunter pathway. Having failed to find an excuse to get his teammates to take notice of hunter-related clues, Leonard exhaled silently and no longer had any doubts regarding Klein's theory. He believed it to be the truth. Next, how should I make everyone realize that Ince has been possessed by an evil spirit of the hunter pathway? Leonard fell into deep thought. He waited until Soest finished reading the telegram and handed it to the other teammates before he came up with something. He decided to take a risk. Before he spoke, he subconsciously glanced at Daly Simone. Dressed in a spirit medium's attire, this lady lowered her hand slightly, indicating that he shouldn't be too anxious, and to stop whatever he was about to attempt. Ma'am, Daly is telling me that it isn't time, that I should wait for a better opportunity? Amidst his hesitation, he saw Daly flick the telegram in her hand and looked around the room. I have an idea. What is it? Soest asked. Daly smiled. I suspect that Zangwill is possessed by an evil spirit. She just said it like that. She will be suspected. Leonard jumped in fright. Without waiting for Soest, Cindy, and company to raise their doubts, Daly continued, Zangwill was once a gatekeeper, and now, he's a nightwatcher. His body can accommodate evil spirits and use their powers. Furthermore, he also has 0-08's help. If I were him, I'd definitely try to seek out stronger evil spirits and raise my strength as much as possible. This way, before he obtains complete control over the evil spirit, there will be backlashes. Zangwill will take actions that seem contradictory. This can explain what's mentioned on the telegram. In addition, haven't we been puzzled as to why Zangwill has been trying to contact important members of the numinous episcopate, and we had come up with various theories? Perhaps getting them to help him exorcise, purify, or completely control the evil spirit is his goal. Soest thought for a moment and deliberated over his words. That possibility cannot be ruled out, but this is fundamentally a subjective theory of yours. How did you come up with this? Which details gave you the inspiration? Leonard became nervous as Daly chuckled. This is a woman's intuition. It's just like how I know your thoughts, as well as those of the rest of you at times. Besides, since this is a discussion and analysis, we should list down all the possibilities. We should then eliminate the possibilities based on the actual investigations. This will aid us in finding the correct answer. Therefore, we need to let our thoughts wander. No matter how ridiculous the idea is, we must dare to propose it. From the various details we obtained from our feedback, I believe my theory is the most likely one. Ma'am Daly sure is good with words. At least, she has convinced me. She raised the theory of an evil spirit's possession to protect me and direct the risk towards herself. On this matter regarding Zangwill, she seems willing to take on everything. Leonard became enlightened as he felt poignant. After hearing Daly's reply, Soest nodded slightly. Indeed, since this is a discussion, we shouldn't limit our thoughts. The possibility of an evil spirit possession scenario is quite high. I'll report this to Her Excellency Goddess's Eye. I'll leave it to the Archbishop and high-ranking deacons to decide the subsequent investigations. After all, we know too little about 0-08. The Red Gloves team led by Soas discovered in Zangwill's abnormalities from the feedback from various telegrams. Daily Simone used this opportunity to mention the assumption of an evil spirit's possession and had received a unanimous agreement. She claimed it to be a reasonable theory, but she was already in the know. She had learned it from Leonard Mitchell, who has a parasite, and Leonard Mitchell's information source came from a letter sent by Rionette Tynker. Who could be the one who mailed it? Meanwhile, Leonard Mitchell and Daily Simone had already suspected that the evil spirit possessing its Zangwill belongs to the Hunter pathway. A classic quill dabbed in black ink was writing rapidly on an ordinary notebook as though it was held by an invisible hand. Suddenly, a silently pale hand reached out and grabbed the quill. The owner of that hand had dark blonde hair with facial features akin to a classic sculpture. One of his eyes was so blue that it was nearly black, and the other was filled with small but obvious blood vessels. He lowered his wrist and continued writing. But is this the truth to the matter? Will everything develop according to what Daily Simone, Leonard Mitchell, and Soast's Red Gloves team have in mind? In the forsaken land of the gods, in Noise City which couldn't be illuminated by the lightning. The figures looked over without making any sound, giving Derek a fright. He nearly stopped the illumination effect as he dodged to avoid facing them directly. However, having trained from a young age, and with his experience over the past year, he didn't end up flustered. He didn't rush to end it as he forcefully held back his horror and waited for the chief to give the next order. Two dark green, complicated symbols appeared in Colin Iliad's eyes. He took in the streets that were blanketed with faint mist and the seemingly normal figures which didn't take any action. Suddenly, he grunted and genuflected, his hands grabbing the two swords that were stabbed in the ground. At the back of his neck, his bluish-black skin swelled a little as indescribable and complicated mysterious symbols appeared. They were half illusory and half real as they crept to either higher or lower levels. At the same time, Shepherd Lovia let out a painful grunt as she raised her hands and held her head, vomiting some blobs of squirming flesh and blood. Her palms and her body seemed to have silver armor strangely appear, overlapping on top of her. "Stop," Demon Hunter Colin muttered softly 1 second later. Derek hurriedly ended the illumination and allowed the thin mist to cloak the figures, allowing the dead silence to once again blanket the ancient Noise City. Everything quickly returned to its former form as Colin Iliad slowly got up. He cast his heavy gaze at the tower, cathedral, and other buildings that could barely be made out through the thin mist. It's a bit different from my last expedition. I'm not sure why there are such changes either. Demon Hunter Colin retracted his gaze as he surveyed the team members. Do you have any ideas or thoughts? Shepherd Lovia had already crouched down to pick up the blobs of flesh and blood that had fallen to the ground. However, she wasn't in a rush to stuff them into her mouth, to munch on them before swallowing. She offered, "We can change directions and explore Noise City's other entrances. Perhaps we might discover something." She had been maintaining her silence and kept the attitude of a spectator the entire journey. This was the first time she was voicing out her thoughts and giving her point of view. Chapter 939 Bait Colin Iliad glanced at Lovia without giving a direct response. After he pulled out the two swords in the ground, he nodded and said, "Okay." The group of 5 circled around Noise City's perimeter, making a few attempts to enter, but they were frightened away by the seemingly normal but silent city's carrying out of its daily routine. They didn't dare to venture in. With the frequency of the lightning reducing, and how darkness was slowly beginning to rule the world, Colin took a deep look at Noise City for a few seconds and said, "We will first set up a small camp. We will continue when it's daytime." The so-called daytime meant when the frequency of lightning was relatively higher, keeping the moments of darkness to a minimum. The expedition team members didn't object to it. Soon, they set up a simple camp by the riverside amidst a series of rocks. At the extreme end of the camp, there was a huge boulder providing them with shelter so there weren't any worries about rain. A bonfire was burning with all kinds of strange creature carcasses piled to the side. From time to time, they would be thrown in as timber. Colin, Lovia, and company sat around the fire, eating the rations they had brought and the monster corpses that had been proven to not cause serious harm. As the fat sizzled from the roasting, Chief Colin Iliad from the 6-member council looked at Derek Berg and said, "We shall inspect the camp first. We'll switch when they're done with their meals." If this were any other time, Derek wouldn't have thought otherwise. But now, the first thought that came to mind was, the chief wishes to speak to me in private. All right. Derek stuffed the remaining piece of meat into his mouth and lifted the thunder god's roar at his side. The piece of meat was clearly already ready, but it still presented a ghastly green color. After coming to the dark edge of the camp, Demon Hunter Colin said in a deep voice, his tone unchanging, "Noise City is more sinister and dangerous than I expected. I'm wondering if you have any views on what we should do next. I know nothing about this place. I'm also lacking in experience. Why is Chief asking for my views?" Derek was instantly taken aback, wishing to raise his left hand to scratch the back of his head. He then recalled the few times he had spoken with the chief while they were in the City of Silver. He recalled Mr. Hanged Man's analysis of the hidden context in their conversations as he suddenly realized something. Chief is giving me a hint. He's trying to tell me that Noise City is more sinister and dangerous than he expected. The difficulty of hunting a shapeshifter far exceeds his expectations. He's wondering if there's a possibility of changing the target. He wishes for me to pray to Mr. Fool and receive a revelation so as to get his views? Mr. World really is a wise person. Along the way, he had already told me of a method to hunt the Bizarro Bane in a relatively easy manner. It's by getting its blood. With the present situation, it seems like his plan is feasible. As his thoughts raced, Derek replied earnestly, "Yes, Your Excellency. I have some suggestions." Colin Iliad silently heaved a sigh of relief, holding back the more direct speech he had prepared as he nodded gently. "Go ahead. Since Noise City has changed, it will be very risky for us to enter. Perhaps we can consider luring the shapeshifter out." Derek didn't directly regurgitate the World Gehrman Sparrow's method, but he did make some modifications based on the present situation. Colin didn't directly reject it, and said rather seriously, "Then how should we lure the shapeshifter?" Derek didn't hesitate to say, "I have an item that is extremely enticing to shapeshifters. As long as it's placed at the boundary of Noise City, or even further, it will lure a shapeshifter out." The grizzled Colin wasn't surprised by his words. He amiably nodded and said, "What's the item?" He long knew that Derek Berg had secretly held a bestowment ritual at night during his guard duty shift. Furthermore, if he hadn't kept the truth under cover, it was impossible for Derek to keep it from Lovia, and Gonlin. Derek didn't know what its name or description was. He immediately took out an iron black box which was completely different from the City of Silver's style before removing the wall of spirituality. Following that, he didn't lower his head. Instead, he turned his head and opened the box solely using his sense of touch. Inside the box was a palm-sized human-shaped object. A cursory glance allowed one to see the transparent liquid filling the inside. From time to time, it bubbled, emanating a black glow. Upon scrutinizing it, there appeared to be maggots circling around the object. This was the true soul body of the spirit world plunderer which Klein had previously obtained. He believed that, for the Bizarro Bane, this Beyonder ingredient had an unparalleled allure. This wasn't simply a result of the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence, but it was also because once the Bizarro Bane obtained it, it could turn into a complete Bizarro sorcerer. It would break through all kinds of limitations and receive a fundamental improvement in its life's natural order, truly becoming a demigod. Therefore, to make the hunting of the Bizarro Bane simpler and clearer, without wasting any time, Klein took the risk of losing the true soul body of the spirit world plunderer by lending it to Little Sunday. Colin Iliad looked at it carefully for a few seconds before retracting his gaze. "It's likely to be effective. Close the box and stop adding a wall of spirituality to it. Just bring it around with you. Let's see if they will be attracted to our camp. They? Derek subconsciously asked. Colin, with a few old scars on his face, revealed a smile. Do you think there's only one shapeshifter in Noise City? If this item's level was lacking, would even be worried that it might attract more terrifying monsters. Derek wore a look of shame as he scratched the back of his head. Following the chief's instructions, he closed the iron black square box's lid, stuffing it into a concealed pocket in his clothes. In the patrol that followed, he kept a high level of vigilance, but no shapeshifter attacked. After a while, Lovia, Leger, and Gonlin took over their mission as Derek sat back beside the warm fire. At that moment, he heard cawing as 7 to 8 red-eyed ravens flew over and spiraled in midair. This brought about an indescribable sense of horror. Colin Iliad drew his sword and looked up. Suddenly, his heart stirred as he quickly cast his gaze to Derek Berg. On both sides of the bonfire, 2 brownish-yellow-haired youths who had childlike looks and were nearly 9 meters tall were staring at each blankly. Colin's eyes narrowed as he immediately shouted, "Illuminate." One of the youths was taken aback. After a moment of enlightenment, pure, warm sunlight was emitted from his body. With a whoosh, an incomplete shadow swept past as Colin's sword sliced through the fake Derek. It was a shadow, a blurry, transparent shadow. At the same time, a red-eyed raven fell from the sky. Its body swelled up, turning into a pitch-black shadow. Above this shadow shimmered a transparent, ghostly blue single eye. Around the eye were similar eyes but smaller. Shapeshifter. A shapeshifter that could disguise itself as ravens. Just as this pitch-black shadow landed, Derek's mind turned numb as he could hardly move, as though he was being petrified. All he could do was watch the enemy pounce at him. Paw! The shapeshifter slammed into an invisible wall and failed to take a further step. Beside the bonfire, Colin Iliad stabbed the sword in his hand into the ground and drew the other sword on his back. The surrounding area lit up, and like the legendary dawn, it descended upon this abandoned land. Infinite beams of light reminiscent of dawn erupted, turning into an illusory ocean. It devoured the pitch-black shadows along with all the ravens from the bottom up. At the entrance of the camp, an illusory knight in silver armor, standing more than 5 meters tall, appeared behind Shepherd Lovia. The knight's eyes burned with dark red flames as they instantly locked onto a spot. He suddenly opened up his stride and appeared hundreds of meters away in a flash. Beams of sharp silver light shot out, dicing all the objects around into tiny, neat pieces, including all the different monsters hiding there. It included the shapeshifter that had used some ability to escape the demon hunter's lethal strike. The monster hadn't died as it switched its true body once again, but the pure, bright light of dawn descended once again, completely drowning a huge area. After the light of dawn turned faint, Colin Iliad in his brown coat appeared with 2 swords in hand. He calmly watched as points of light gathered above the ground which was covered with cracks. Black-red blood which had mostly evaporated was slowly dispersed. Success! As Derek reeled in delight, he hurriedly sealed the black square box with a wall of spirituality. Colin immediately stabbed the 2 swords into the ground, took out 3 metal bottles that had been emptied of their potions, and filled them with the blood on the ground. While waiting for the ingredient to take form, he said to Lovia and company with his usual expression, "I have a use for the ingredients left by the shapeshifter. I wish to directly make an exchange for them." In the City of Silver, there were typically 2 ways to handle the spoils from such expeditions. First, it was to bring it back and give it to the city and exchange it for the corresponding contribution points. The distribution depended on the amount of effort put in during the expedition. Second, if it wasn't something especially important, and if it had caught the fancy of a member of the expedition, they could directly make an exchange for it with equivalent items or contribution points. "I have no objections," Leger and Gonlin answered in unison. Lovia didn't say a word as a form of tacit consent. After the illusory silver-armored knight returned, she turned her head and looked towards the bonfire where Derek Berg was with a deadpan expression. In East Balam, in the temporary office for the Red Gloves. Soas surveyed the area and said to all the team members, "Her Excellency, Goddess's Eye, has ordered us to investigate the sale of hunter pathway ingredients in the local and surrounding cities, as well as any disappearances or deaths of beyonders of the same pathway. She agrees with Daly's guess, and she suspects from the death of the Inta spies that it's an evil spirit of the hunter pathway. Of course, we mustn't ignore any abnormalities since it's only one possibility. There's also another thing. We only need to do the gathering of information and to ignore everything else. We will not delve deeper into the investigations. It's an order by Her Excellency, Goddess's Eye. Got that? Yes. Cindy and company replied. Soas looked at Leonard and Daly before retracting his gaze and said heavily, "Move out." Chapter 940. A story. After leaving the local Nighthawks' base, which was disguised as a private detective office, Leonard glanced at Daly Simone, who had suggested to team up with him. Where do we begin? Any suggestions? Dressed in a spirit medium black robe with her hood pulled over her head, Daly Simone, with an uncanny beauty and mature air, shot Leonard Mitchell a glance. This is when a gentleman's decisiveness and style should be showcased. Leonard looked at his left hand, which was wearing a red glove. He deliberated and said, "If we begin by following Captain Soast's arrangements, that might allow us to find some clues, but it's not necessarily useful. I suspect that Her Excellency Goddess's Eye knows that. She's only giving us something to do in order to confuse Insangwil." Why do you say that? Daly wasn't joking, as her expression wore a rare, solemn look. Leonard glanced to his sides as he said in a heavy voice without realizing it, "Based on what I know, 0-08 has the characteristic of, once you know it, it will also know you. We shouldn't be influenced while staying on the periphery of its perception since we aren't sure of its real name or powers, and only use the code name we gave it. But as Red Gloves who are pursuing the numinous episcopate's matters, and having discussed Insangwil many times, I believe our situation has already been grasped by 0-08. This way, Insangwil should know that his abnormal state has been exposed. From that, he will avoid us by creating coincidences." Daly recalled the information regarding Insangwil and nodded. Soast had also mentioned this problem in the beginning. However, he didn't verbalize it as clearly as you did. It's still in the stage of backward inference from a result of failures. Therefore, Her Excellency Goddess's Eye has gotten us to investigate the situation of the nearby district's hunter pathway beyonders and ingredients, and pretending as though nothing is confirmed. In the meantime, Her Excellency is preparing the usage of some corresponding items to lay a trap for the moment when the evil spirit gains control over Insangwil and thus appears. Leonard turned his body and spoke as he walked. That's probably the case, but I suspect that it's unlikely for 0-08 to not know of it. Daly followed diagonally behind as she said in thought, "I believe there's still a chance for success. Don't forget that one of the honorific names of the goddess is the Mother of Concealment. That can counter 0-08. The Church has a high-ranking member or sealed artifact that can counter 0-08. It's no wonder 0-08 was once obtained by the Church and sealed under the Holy Cathedral." Leonard's eyes lit up as he came to a realization. Daly nodded very slightly as her expression turned soft. A few seconds later, her pupils contracted as she blurted out, "Do you think our discussion has caught the attention of 0-08? Leonard's expression fell, but he didn't dare confirm anything nor shake his head. He and Daly looked at each other, looking back and forth as they fell silent for a moment. In a particular room, a slightly pale hand flipped a notebook to its very first page, then it flipped one page after another. After leaving Bansi Harbor, Saran Einhorn Medici, who had obtained a certain object, was no longer only stubborn or only capable of instinctively conspiring. After repeated struggles and resisting, Insangwil and he had obtained a truce and had even decided on having a limited cooperative effort so as to achieve each other's goals. To an evil spirit of the Red Priest pathway, such a promise cannot be guaranteed to be effective, but Insangwil no longer had any other choice. From his point of view, this series of matters had many coincidences, but fundamentally, this was inevitable. At the very least, Saran Einhorn Medici was many times better at creating stories than him. After confirming the destination to be the southern continent's East Balam, Insangwil boarded a ship to the Berserk Sea. Every time, he would enter the Intis colonial islands, irrationally provoking the official Beyonders and hunting Beyonders from the hunter pathway. Then, before danger arrived, he would quickly regain lucidity, cover his tracks, and flee far away. This might seem like a coincidence, but the problem is when it's the same coincidence every time. Is it too much of a coincidence? From the perspective of logic and reason, too many coincidences imply that certain elements or rules were secretly in existence. The reason why Ince was able to do that was because he had written the words above. Using the quill of Al-Zahad, he naturally allowed himself to switch between the two states of being possessed by an evil spirit and self-autonomy. What a scheming fellow. This wasn't only directed at Ince Zangwill, but also at Sauron Einhorn Medici. They were clearly already coexisting in peace, but they acted out to be in conflict as though they were relying on an external force to achieve some semblance of balance. Ince Zangwill's purchase of additional Bard and Warrior Pathway Beyonder ingredients was very reasonable. This was because he was hiding the clues that the evil spirit was using him to seek out various items of the Hunter Pathway, and to prevent others from realizing that all of this was under his tacit agreement, disguising it as his attempts to resist. In addition, the Bard and Warrior Pathways had the ability to resist the dead and exorcise evil spirits. As long as a clever person were to think it over carefully, they would undoubtedly notice this and verify that Ince Zangwill was being possessed. After numerous provocations, the Iron and Blood Cross Order's Tony Down finally locked onto Ince Zangwill and began pursuing him. During this process, this war bishop, who had made his goal to become a conqueror, showed off his powers without any restraint. When a storm happened to stop his pursuit, he appeared on a ship filled with ordinary people in an eye-catching manner before pulling out the fellow disguised as Ince Zangwill. This was a little coincidental, but it was nothing surprising. This was because the Iron and Blood Cross Order's belief is for the supernatural to be known to all, and to be placed above all ordinary people. And Tony Down's unbridled arrogance often used his own strength to shatter the doubts of others and had extremely great confidence. Therefore, the way he acted was without a problem. Likewise, he was overly confident, causing him to neglect the possibility that Ince Zangwill was also on the ship. This didn't match his intuition as a hunter, but in this world, anyone could make mistakes. When Ince Zangwill disembarked on Waypoint Island, he sensed someone observing him from a first-class cabin, but he didn't mind it. This was exactly the effect he wanted. It was the best development if someone among the passengers happened to know him. Yes, happened to. It was neither too early or too late. Before Soast's Red Gloves took action, Ince Zangwill met with Hand of White Palenque Tisiblius of the Numinous Episcopate's Artificial Death faction, hoping to obtain their help in exorcising the evil spirit, traces of words scribbled away. The development of things became a little odd. Before having a sufficient amount of clues, Leonard Mitchell and Daly Simone of the Soast's Red Gloves team seemed to come to a conclusion. It apparently came from a letter sent by Rionette Tynker. Where did the problem lie? Ince Zangwill was rather puzzled by this. From his point of view, unless one could directly capture Palenque Tisiblius or other key personnel of the Numinous Episcopate, no one could come up with such a conclusion so quickly. This made his preparations a little hasty, but thankfully, this was an outcome he wanted. The Red Gloves team led by Soast discovered Ince Zangwill's abnormalities from the feedback from various telegrams. Daly Simone used this opportunity to mention the assumption of an evil spirit's possession and had received a unanimous agreement. She claimed it to be a reasonable theory, but she was already in the know. She had learned it from Leonard Mitchell, who has a parasite, and Leonard Mitchell's information source came from a letter sent by Rionette Tynker. Who could be the one who mailed it? Meanwhile, Leonard Mitchell and Daly Simone had already suspected that the evil spirit possessing Ince Zangwill belongs to the Hunter Pathway. But is this the truth to the matter? Will everything develop according to what Daly Simone, Leonard Mitchell, and Soast's Red Gloves team have in mind? After the discussion with that person in the Cathedral of Serenity, the Cathedral of Serenity's high-ranking deacon, Ilya, believed Daly's theory and decided to use a Grade 1 Hunter Pathway sealed artifact as bait, so as to allow Ince Zangwill to fall into a trap while the evil spirit was possessing him. To conceal this goal, she got Soast's Red Gloves team to continue investigating the relevant clues. Unfortunately, their premise was wrong. Although Ins Zangwil was possessed by an evil spirit, his actions had never been affected. All he had done before was an act. It was done in accordance with Sauron Einhorn Medici's suggestions, with the aim to confuse the Church of Evernight and to make Ilya blindly attack. And a Red Angel evil spirit that was willing to help and cooperate was enough to change the battlefield situation. Ins Zangwil's true motive for coming to the southern continent is, hunt the high-ranking deacon, Ilya, of the Church of Evernight. It was for his advancement preparations by obtaining her Beyonder characteristic. He wanted to prove to everyone that the Church of Evernight had made a foolish mistake to abandon him back then. Of course, before beginning this operation, Ins Zangwil had to first satisfy Sauron Einhorn Medici's thirst for mid and high sequence Beyonder characteristics of the hunter pathway. To keep it a secret, he didn't plan on hunting locally, and he had prepared to do it further away. When the evil spirit's undying nature, Red Angel's level, and the uniqueness of a gatekeeper combined, Ins Zangwil possessed the relatively high sequence ability of spirit world traversal of the death pathway. He was able to head to remote areas and return in short periods of time. He had deliberately kept this under wraps before. After satisfying Sauron Einhorn Medici, Ins Zangwil decided to first kill Daly Simone and Leonard Mitchell and pretend to vaguely sense the Church of Evernight's trap. He would forcefully counterattack, only to lose his rationality and head for the trap. He didn't plan on leaving any unstable elements. All Avengers that survived Tingen had to die. The notebook flipped to an empty spot as a pale white hand grabbed a quill and added the words, "Today, everything will go smoothly. West Balam, Northern State, Kukoa City. You aren't done with your investigations?" Anderson asked in boredom as he walked beside Danitz. "Soon." Danitz replied as he found it a little difficult to focus. "Do you have something to do?" At this moment, Anderson took out a map and a stack of information. He said with a chuckle, "I've already figured out the rough location of an ancient mausoleum. Based on the traditions of East and West Balam, there's definitely plenty of treasure in it. Here, death doesn't mean an end but a new beginning. That's why they have tons of burial items." Danitz was taken aback as he asked in surprise, "I thought you aren't proficient in Dudanese?" How did he gather the information? Anderson chuckled and raised his black-gloved left palm. He spread his fingers and said, "I don't, but I can temporarily steal their language until I finish finding the information. I knew a fellow like you will have some tricks up his sleeves." Danitz said with gritted teeth as he pointed to the main street beside the square. "Goodbye." Anderson didn't stop him as he smilingly watched him walk away with large strides. At this moment, the two simultaneously noticed a figure walking over. The figure held a classic quill and wore a black clergyman's robe. He had dark blonde hair with facial features akin to a classic sculpture. One of his eyes was so blue that it was nearly black, and the other was filled with small but obvious blood vessels. He was approaching Anderson and Danitz. Anderson didn't know the middle-aged man, but his body couldn't help but tremble as though he was facing his nemesis. Warning signs of danger flashed in his mind as his pupils rapidly dilated. Suddenly, he heard a warm voice by his ears, "Don't be nervous." "Who?" Anderson blankly turned his head and saw a figure strangely appear beside him despite there not being anyone there in the first place. This figure had apparently been there all this time, but he had always been ignored. He wore a strangely simple white robe. He had a pale gold beard that covered half his face. His light-colored eyes were clear like a child's. He had a genial and reserved look. Looking at the quill in Ins Zangwil's hand, this middle-aged man who was dressed like an ordinary priest half closed his eyes, raised his right hand, and gestured 4 points before him. Hanging there was a silver cross. Chapter 941 Development adheres to logic. The moment he saw the middle-aged man dressed in a priest's getup, Anderson zoned out for a second. Following that, some shackles in his mind suddenly collapsed as countless memory fragments surged through an invisible barrier. It felt like long-suppressed feelings suddenly erupted. He remembered the things that had happened over the past 2 months. He remembered the mission that the demigod had given him. Back in Biyao, he followed the thoughts in his mind to meet up with the demigod. He followed him and left the Rorsted archipelago for a secret location. There, he met the priest beside him. It was arranged for him to enter an ancient coffin, to lay there among Beyonder ingredients and a liquid filled with strange mixed blood, allowing them to seep into him. After a month of this corrosive treatment, a dark red chrysalis formed inside his body. He then had his memories from this period of time sealed before being sent to West Balam. He was then psychologically cued to not leave until he recovered his memories. This meant that he hadn't finished the demigod's mission and that it was still underway. Everything that had happened before were just preparations. Scenes flashed through his mind as Anderson discovered that while he was playing the harmonica on the streets, checking into the hotel with Danitz, obtaining of language comprehension charms from the Church of Knowledge's preachers, as well as his arrival in Northern State, all of these incidents had this genial and seemingly innocent priest present beside him the entire time. When having meals, he was sitting at a neighboring table. When he checked in, the neighboring room was his. When walking on the streets, he was walking right beside him. When playing the harmonica and putting on the ventriloquist act, this man was looking at him in a genial manner. And Anderson hadn't noticed any of this back then. Danitz, who was beside him, the people around him, none of them had noticed him. It was as though they had never seen this priest before. A chill that arose from deep in his heart ran from his tailbone up his spine to his brain. He felt that the experiences he had been through were enough to drive him insane, to the point of losing control. Danitz, who had already opened up a distance from Anderson, looked at the black-robed clergyman, in Zangwill, and then he looked at the simple priest who was praying with his eyes closed. He hurriedly bowed his head and used ancient Hermes to softly chant, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." A few days earlier, he had received Mr. Fool's revelation to handle some matters as a guise to stay around Anderson. It was so that he could immediately pray if any abnormalities were to happen. Although he didn't know what would happen, or who he had encountered, Danitz, who always cherished his life, didn't hold back and did as he was told even if the abnormalities that happened might very well be him being overly imaginative. For this, he had specially worn the boxing glove made from Grozel's Beyonder characteristic. It ensured that he would act first without thinking so as to not waste any time. At this point, Ince Zangwill had stopped walking. His dark blue, nearly black eye and the eye filled with blood vessels reflected the priest in simple white robes who had a cross hanging by his chest. In his mind, in his mouth, a furious voice sounded, "Adam. The Creator's son, King of Angels, Adam." Before Ince Zangwill could finish his sentence, the priest opposite him opened his eyes. His light-colored eyes were already pure gold in color. Suddenly, pitch-black stone columns were erected around them, setting up a majestic cathedral. Inside this cathedral, each column, each arch, and each dome's surface was embedded with the bones of different races. They were densely packed as they used different eye sockets to stare at Ince Zangwill. They surrounded a cross that was more than 100 meters tall. In front of the cross, a blurry figure stood there as though he was watching everything with compassion. This was a cathedral of corpses, but instead of appearing eerie, it was filled with holiness. The walls, windows, and doors of the cathedral had transparent, warped faces protruding out. It was as though countless souls were sealed inside, preventing Beyonders from sensing the existence of the spirit world or astral world. The square and pedestrians from before had vanished. They were kept outside the corpse cathedral that had suddenly appeared. Ince Zangwill's classic quill had already flown up as it wrote rapidly on his black clergyman's robe, "Anderson Hood is Gehrman Sparrow's friend." Ouroboros had taken notice of him, and due to various unknown reasons, Ouroboros's appearance here was a development that adhered to logic. Just as the quill wrote the exclamation mark, light beams shone in from the colored windows of the corpse cathedral, forming stacked illusory pure feathers. Beneath the enveloping feathers, a figure with long silver hair materialized in a genuflecting, praying stance. Following that, the figure stood up straight. He wore a simple linen robe and had handsome looks and soft facial features. He was none other than King of Angels, Tail Devourer Ouroboros. Ouroboros's eyes were momentarily unfocused, but it soon reflected the genial priest's image. In his eyes, at his feet, and on the stacked feathers of light behind him, a supernatural, mysterious circle was accentuated, forming an illusory river like a snake that had its head connected to its tail. The corpse cathedral once again reverted to the point when the pitch-black stone columns erected with the surrounding square were still on the border of existence. Taking this opportunity, Ouroboros flew out. Zangwill didn't hesitate as he made the surrounding colors saturate and overlap against each other. Just as this night watcher was about to step into the spirit world, he suddenly saw a cross spanning more than 100 meters in size plummet down from high above. This cross impaled the middle of the unformed corpse cathedral as the blurry figure that carried the cross raised its head. Infinite light spewed out, drowning Ouroboros and the quill holding Zangwill within. The corpse cathedral filled with bones of different races and the countless warped souls took form once again. Upon hearing the stacked, illusory pleas, Klein was inside his hotel and thinking about his daily miscellaneous matters and lampooning in boredom. He suddenly stood up, went straight to the window and looked towards the nearby square. On the square, coffins were coming and going. The fountain was still spewing, and there was reverberating music. Everything seemed normal and even felt idyllic. Here, what seemed most unharmonious was Anderson genuflecting with a stiff expression while a trembling Danitz was closing his eyes praying. Without a second thought, Klein followed the plan he had formulated above the gray fog. He controlled Winner Enzo, who was 100 meters away, to enter the telegraph office. He had instructed Danitz to live beside a telegraph office. At the same time, he took out his adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. Rionette Tinker walked out of the void with the 4 blonde, red-eyed heads in hand. All 8 eyes turned to the square. For Leonard, Miss Messenger. He likely hasn't left your detection range. Klein took out a letter he had already prepared and a gold coin before handing it to Miss Messenger. What he said and did was akin to a marionette. He only followed the instructions he had prepared in advance. If he couldn't help think of something else, he would immediately use cogitation to divert his attention. This was the method he figured out from Will Septon on how to deal with 0-08. By doing the thinking above the gray fog, all he did was act according to plan in the real world. And in a particular prayer from Danitz, Klein had used the scene that appeared to observe Anderson, who was nearby. In the end, he discovered an unfamiliar priest who also felt familiar by his side. Thinking back to the psychology alchemists and the Twilight Hermit Order's hidden connection, and making the connection to the content in Emperor Roselle's diary, Klein immediately realized something. He was certain about what would happen next. The master of the Twilight Hermit Order, the son of the creator, angel of imagination Adam, was conspiring to obtain 0-08. This also meant that there was a high chance for Zangwill to appear with Anderson as the target. Then, Klein redid his plan above the gray fog, pretending as though he had never noticed anything. He continued his state as a marionette in reality. One of Rionette Tinker's heads bit onto the letter as the 8 eyes looked deeply at Klein for 2 seconds. Klein nodded indiscernibly without a word, watching Miss Messenger return to the spirit world. In the Kukua telegraph office, Winner Enzo handed over the telegram, address, and Verl gold he had already prepared for the staff, urging them to send it immediately. West Balam, Northern State, Kukua. Zangwill has appeared. The radio waves quickly spread, sending the message to the major bases of the Church of Evernight in West Balam and East Balam. East Balam. Why are you always active around the cathedral? Why don't you go further to carry out the investigations? Daly asked Leonard. Leonard thought and said frankly and seriously, awaiting news. Daly nodded in thought without prying further. She turned silent, no longer playing jokes on Leonard. It was as though she was waiting for something as well. Suddenly, Leonard's spiritual perception was triggered as he turned to look left. As a gatekeeper, Daly had already cast her eyes in that direction. A letter had appeared at some point in time, landing underneath a gas street lamp. Leonard didn't avoid Daly as he hurriedly picked up the envelope and opened it. The content of the letter was very simple. There was only one line: West Balam, Northern State, Kukua, Revival Square. Coordinates. Leonard's expression turned heavy as he turned to Daleen said, "Ma'am, please help me to cover my tracks." As he spoke, his left glove had turned transparent. He stuffed his right hand into his pocket and grasped the fate siphon charm. Daly fell silent for a second and said extremely seriously, "Bring me along. Back then, you managed to at least fight, but I didn't have the time to do anything." Leonard's expression changed as his mouth gaped slightly. Finally, without saying a word, he grabbed Daly's shoulder. The two then vanished from the rather empty streets. As he watched Miss Messenger leave, and once he confirmed that the telegraph office had at least sent one telegram, Klein immediately took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered above the gray fog. He directly sat at the high-back chair of the fool and beckoned for the tyrant card, the sea god scepter, and a silver-gray charm. Immediately, he was wearing a papal tiara with a papal robe draped over him with a bone scepter in hand. Amidst silver bolts of lightning, Klein spread his spirituality towards the point of light where Danitz was. Chapter 942 Deity's Curse. With Klein's spirituality making contact, the points of light suddenly expanded into a scene before his eyes. With his shadow cloak up, Danitz was praying with his head bowed in the corner of the square, chanting the fool's honorific name with ancient Hermes. Thanks to this, Klein could see an expanded area around him, and he began searching for Nsangwil. Through the gray fog, everything he saw was clearly different from what he had previously seen. In the middle of the square, a pitch-black corpse-embedded cathedral had appeared at some point in time. It was dark inside, but there wasn't any signs of activity inside. Using this opportunity, Klein replied Danitz's prayer, "Leave the area. Find a hidden spot to hide in." As he spoke slowly, dressed in the papal tiara and dark robes, Klein raised his left hand and made the blue gems at the tip of the bone scepter light up. Sharp, jarring sounds immediately resounded in Revival Square in the real world as a sudden gale swept the area. It made the people who were spending their leisure time there or the pedestrians to leave quickly to head for shelter from the wind. Even Anderson, who had a frozen expression, recovered his usual insouciant attitude. Holding his abdomen, he quickly rushed out of the dangerous area. In a few seconds, Revival Square became extremely silent. Even the pedestrians who walked slowly without running had experienced the feeling of flying with the nudging of the wind. The empty area entered a brief silence. Then, a flame appeared from the corpse cathedral's window. It grew in size and became increasingly blinding. Silently, the colored glass windows shattered as blinding white light that bordered on blue shot out like a meteor. This flaming light instantly crumbled, materializing into Nsangwil, who wore a black clergyman's robe and had one dark blue eye and one eye covered with blood vessels. The moment this night watcher appeared, he couldn't help but open his mouth and scoff at the classic quill in his hand. "If a fool like you didn't listen to my suggestion, how could something like this happen? I'm not even sure what you're afraid of. If you had allowed me to pray to the Lord, allowing me to secretly return to the Rose Redemption and join forces with the serpent, our preparations would allow us to set up a trap. Today, we will be the ones hunting Adam, and not the other way round." The seemingly dark and damaged quill immediately flew up and rode on an empty spot of Nsangwil's clothes. Due to a rage stemming from embarrassment, Sauron Einhorn Medici pushed the blame of this development to the quill of Alzahad, but in fact, it was he who was stopping himself from praying to the true creator. Be it Sauron or Einhorn, neither one of them trusted this evil god. Today's development made this evil spirit's psychological dissociation to worsen. This is extremely reasonable. This is the diagnosis by the best, most professional psychiatrist. Nsangwil immediately frowned as he raised his left hand and pressed it to his head. His dark blue eye rapidly recovered its luster as the classically sculpted face turned extremely stern. At this moment, having escaped the corpse cathedral, he was no longer facing the square. Instead, it was flights of ancient stone stairs. They were leading to the peak of a towering mountain. Erected there was a huge cross with countless angels spiraling around it. At this moment, an exaggerated bolt of silver lightning tore through the overcast sky, smiting right down at Nsangwil. The sealed and strange space produced cracks. The fountain and its splashes appeared in his dark blue eye. Zangwill's figure immediately vanished, leaving behind a blurry transparent spirit. The latter was struck by lightning and was instantly obliterated. This night watcher didn't have the luxury of time to consider what other lurking dangers there were. He took this opportunity to transform into a flame as he penetrated a crack and rushed out. To him, no matter what lay ahead of him, nothing was more terrifying and difficult to deal with than the son of the Creator, King of Angels Adam. Upon seeing the flame rise up from the square, allowing Zangwill to escape the restraints of the illusory world and returning to his appearance with dark blonde hair and pale hands, Klein raised his head slightly and subconsciously sat straight. Countless scenes flashed across his mind, him having his heart penetrated, the pair of bright leather boots just before his previous death, Dunn Smith smiling at him with a wink of his left eye, and the Blackthorn Security Company which had been reduced to ruins. The corners of Klein's mouth quickly curled upwards as he revealed a comical smile. He then deeply muttered, using ancient Hermes, misfortune. The silver-gray charm on his right palm suddenly burst into a gloomy black light. This was a charm of the misfortune domain Klein made using Snake of Mercury Willocepton's blood and precious metals by praying to the Evernight goddess. This was a present he had prepared for Zangwill. This was an arrow of vengeance. This was a deity's curse. Klein immediately stood up, stretched his shoulders, and threw out his right arm, fusing the gloomy black light with the little powers he could stir from above the grey fog as he threw them at Zangwill. Just as Zangwill returned to Revival Square, he saw a dark black beam appear out of nowhere. It blanketed the entire sky, making him find himself in an extremely dark environment. Such a change happened in a flash before everything was restored to normal in an instant. Nothing seemed amiss, but as a night watcher who could give others a certain level of bad luck, Zangwill acutely smelled the aura of danger. Without any hesitation, he reached out his left palm in a bid to use the evil spirit within him and his powers as a gatekeeper to enter the spirit world and flee. However, none of the surrounding bright flowers, pure white fountain, and dark black tiles had their colors saturate, much less become stacked. Zangwill's spirit world traversal had become ineffective. The glint in his eyes froze as he seemed to understand the reason. It was because the evil spirit in him was having an internal struggle, thus, they wouldn't lend him their power. See? Everything would be fine if you had listened to me. Bullshit. I'd rather die than believe in the true Creator. What's the point saying all of this? Didn't you still end up the same as us, being made into a potion by a Lista tutor? So none of you are nervous at all? Didn't you notice that the curse clearly came with a deity's aura? That power was fundamentally very powerful. Our present condition doesn't allow us to avoid it at all. Continue arguing. Go on. I'll wait to die with all of you. The veins on Zangwill's forehead throbbed when he heard that. He was furious that Sauron Einhorn Medici would suddenly engage in an internal strife at such a critical moment. They didn't seem to notice the danger they were in at all. As a former archbishop, as a Beyonder who had watched over the Church of Evernight's holy artifacts, Zangwill didn't let his judgment become clouded because of his rage. He instinctively believed that the gloomy black beam had something to do with the Evernight goddess's authority over misfortune. He believed that Sauron Einhorn Medici's sudden fallout was clearly a result of this influence. Otherwise, it was impossible for the Red Angel evil spirit to break into a quarrel without concerning themselves with the situation they were in simply because of the quill of Alzahad's writing. He immediately turned around, quickly running towards another exit of Revival Square in an attempt to communicate with other spirits. He wished to borrow their powers to escape, however, there wasn't a single spirit around. At this moment, a figure stood in a hidden corner of the open square. He was a mixed blood with parents coming from Lone and Balam. He had a fleshy face and baggy clothes. On his waist hung a rapier. It was Admiral Hel Ludwell. This was a marionette who usually didn't have any thoughts. After throwing out the deity's curse charm, Klein followed his plan, returned to the real world, and made use of the two marionettes. As he made Enzo find a corner, he took out the items he prepared, set up a bestowment ritual, and controlled Admiral Hel to walk to a secluded spot to face Zangwill. This Admiral Hell, who looked nothing like his original self, raised his right hand, allowing his arm and fingers to rapidly turn incorporeal as they extended towards the target. This was a power he used by borrowing the underworld creature within him to extract the spirit bodies of others remotely. Ludwell's palm quickly turned pale white, and above Ince Zangwill, a figure floated up uncontrollably. However, Ince Zangwill was once a gatekeeper. An illusory bronze door filled with mystery immediately took form in his eyes as it quickly pulled back his escaping spirit body. With his level and strength, this was unlikely to succeed so successfully, but for some reason, he repeatedly made mistakes and nearly allowed Admiral Hell to succeed. For a brief moment, all he could manage to do was a seesaw-like struggle. At this moment, two figures rapidly appeared beside Ludwell. One of them was the black-haired, green-eyed Leonard with a transparent glove in hand, and the other was Davy Simone who had blue eyeshadow and blush. They had arrived at the perfect moment because the bad luck of an enemy often implied that one was lucky enough. The first thing Daly saw was the figure she could never forget. Pangs of fury burned in her eyes instantly. She didn't rashly attack as she made some observations. She came behind Ludwell and spread her arms. A bronze door filled with countless strange patterns immediately descended and creaked open a gap. This was a door that led to the underworld. It was a door filled with a lure to all undead creatures. An indescribable and terrifying suction force came out of it as the figure above Ince Zangwill's body completely separated from him. It was a translucent man wearing blood-stained black armor. He was young and handsome with red hair. His face had terrifying signs of decay, and at his glabella was a flag-like mark. This young man wasn't too surprised about being separated from Ince Zangwill. Instead, he sneered. "We sure are unlucky today. We have already died together once, so is there a need to do so another time? Especially when we're being controlled by such a weakling?" A bloody gap appeared on his upper left cheek as it opened and closed. "All right, let's clear out the surrounding trash." Before the sentence was finished, the man in blood-stained black armor reached out his palm and drew out an illusory sword with dark red rust stains from his body. A terrifying suppressive force easily allowed the evil spirit to free itself from Ludwell's and Daly Simone's extraction. It swooped down in an attempt to return to Ince Zangwill's body. At this moment, a hoarse voice sounding as though it held sandcloth in it. Admiral Hell Ludwell had chanted in ancient Hermes, "Fate." Chapter 943, the third act, Fate. In the awkward-sounding voice, the spots where Admiral Hell Ludwell and Nightwatcher Ince Zangwill stood turned dark as if they were covered by two black clouds. Fate Siphon Charm. This was one of the Fate Siphon charms that Klein had made using the Worms of Time from Palaz Zoroast. To make plans without 0-08's knowledge, he had kept himself hidden behind the scenes the entire time. Not only had he lent creeping hunger to Leonard Mitchell, he had also given the Fate Siphon charm to his marionette. Hence, the one who was possessed by the evil spirit had gone from Ince Zangwill to Ludwell. Admiral Hell instantly had Sauron Einhorn Medici's blood-stained, black-armored body plunge into him as his eyes became filled with minute blood vessels. Inside the hotel, Klein calmly controlled the marionette without showing any wavering or hesitation due to the impact the evil spirit had. Ludwell reached out to tear his clothes and raised the soul-soothing mask to cover his face. At the same time, having heard the Red Angel's words, and witnessing his actual condition, Daly Simone, who had suffered immense pressure, seemed to realize something. Not only did she not close the door to the underworld, she even gritted her teeth and used all her might to widen the gap. Bloody, skinless arms, slimy tentacles with teeth, and bluish-black vines with baby faces began emerging from the door to the underworld as they grabbed at Ludwell. This freed up Admiral Hell, who had planned on completing this step alone. Taking advantage of the opportunity that the underworld within his body hadn't yet been destroyed by Sauron Einhorn Medici, with the only negative effects on his body being decaying, he hurriedly turned around and dashed towards the mysterious, illusory bronze door. He was then grabbed on his body and legs by the arms, tentacles, vines, and spirits behind the door. With his running working hand in hand with the scalp-tingling tugs, he instantly leaped through the widened door gap and entered the underworld. Upon seeing this, Daly immediately pulled back her palm and stopped maintaining the mysterious patterned bronze door. Thud. The indescribable illusory door closed heavily. Admiral Hel Ludwell, along with Sauron Einhorn Medici, were kept out of the real world with the underworld creatures. This was a key step to Klein's plan. It was to forcibly separate the Red Angel evil spirit from Zangwill. Although he believed that the Red Angel evil spirit was the reason for Zangwill's instability, he wasn't willing to face an additional evil spirit formed after the deaths of one king of angels and two sequence 1 angels when taking revenge on a demigod. No one could predict what actions a conspirer would take under such circumstances. Therefore, Klein used the basis of the magical powers of the Fate Siphon Charm and Ludwell's pathway characteristic to formulate a plan. The addition of Daly had allowed the entire process to happen more smoothly. There wasn't any room for being interrupted as they successfully pulled the Red Angel evil spirit into the underworld. This way, even if the evil spirit was able to possess Admiral Hell's body and travel back to the real world via spirit world traversal, it would be far into the future. After all, to leave the underworld required them to find an exit, and with the Evernight goddess wielding control over artificial death, she had a certain level of authority in the underworld. She was definitely not letting the Red Angel evil spirit leave so easily. Sacrificing a marionette, a high-level charm, and 2 mystical items in exchange for removing the Red Angel evil spirit from the battlefield was heart-wrenching for Klein, but it was definitely worth it. As for the misfortune on Zangwill, on the one hand, it was a continuous state and not a short-term affliction, and on the other hand, he had suffered from deity's curse. The Fate Siphon Charm could only replace a tiny portion of that and not empty it out. He could soon recover. As for Ludwell, he had Winner Enzo imbuing him with good luck. Nothing would stop his series of actions for a short period of time. Such a change was completely unexpected for Leonard. However, he had become a red glove for almost a year. He had plenty of experience dealing with supernatural cases, so he didn't show any hesitation or confusion. He immediately cast his gaze at the still-dazed Zangwill. When the figure in a black clergyman's robe with one dim eye was reflected in his eyes, his expression immediately warped as though he was facing a trauma of his. It was a trauma where he did his best but had failed to put it to use. It was the trauma of seeing Captain and Klein already dead after regaining consciousness. As Leonard raised his left palm, he pressed the human-skinned glove to his temple and grasped the Fate Siphon Charm in his right hand tightly. With a deep voice, he said, "Fate." The ancient, supernatural language echoed as a transparent book condensed in front of his left glove. Following that, there was the ethereal chant of, "I came, I saw, I record." Bolts of bright, blinding silver lightning blasted down one after another as they instantly devoured Leonard. Lightning storm. This was akin to Leonard holding a revolver to his temple before pulling the trigger. He was committing suicide, but at the same time, he was using the Fate Siphon Charm. This would transfer such a fate to Zangwill. This was the best solution he could think of when using the Fate Siphon Charm and creeping hunger. It required immense courage. Countless silver lightning swept over, shattering the surrounding darkness. Leonard Mitchell immediately snapped awake and found himself still standing at his spot. His left hand had yet to rise, and his right hand had just grabbed the Fate Siphon Charm. Whatever he did was just a dream. At this moment, in Zangwill's dark blue eyes, darkness was slowly swirling. It was as though it was saying, "When did you get the misconception that you aren't dreaming?" In fact, long before Sauron Einhorn Medici had been extracted from his body, he had already created a large-scale dream in an attempt to pull all his enemies in. Unfortunately, the man with a rapier was in no way affected. He easily escaped and ended up destroying the dream, reducing its effects to nothing. As the ability to detect danger which was gained from one's spiritual perception feedback was that obvious, and with the possibility of the conflict between the two kings of angels behind him spilling over at any moment, Zangwill didn't hesitate to create a large-scale slumber effect while pulling Daly Simone and Leonard Mitchell into a dream. Right on the heels of that, he picked up Quill of Alzahad and rapidly wrote on his sleeve, Zangwill was in optimal condition today. He could effectively control his mythical creature form, therefore, he didn't hold back and used all his strength to escape the area. As he finished writing the sentence with the quill, Zangwill's body began transforming. His eyes instantly turned black as though it was tainted with ink. The fine patterns around him began to extend, forming strange and distorted mysterious symbols. At his waist and ribs, his clothes swelled as 4 skinless arms grew out from squirming flesh. They were covered with blood vessels. The arm was rapidly covered with white feathers as a cadaveric aura rippled out. At the same time, Zangwill's teeth grew long, turning sharp. His body seemed to be embedded with numerous blurry, tiny faces. In a blink of an eye, this night watcher was already slumped on the ground, turning into a strange monster with 8 legs and white feathers. Night suddenly fell upon the square as worms in the soil and the bacteria on the floor tiles died one after another, entering an eternal slumber. This was the combination of the powers of Evernight and Death. Just as Daly Simone and Leonard Mitchell were about to lose their lives amidst their slumber, a thunderclap boomed. Bolts of silver lightning struck down, turning into a forest of lightning that blanketed Zangwill's incomplete mythical creature form. After sending away the Red Angel evil spirit, Klein didn't stay any longer. Like a marionette with preset orders, he mechanically took 4 steps counterclockwise and entered above the gray fog. Wearing the papal tiara and papal robe again, he picked up the sea god scepter. This was the 3rd act of the play. With 0-08 exhausted by Adam, and with the Red Angel evil spirit separated from Zangwill thanks to the Fate Siphon charm, he had to face the sea god's wrath as a sequence 4. Klein knew that he didn't have the strength to directly fight a demigod. Therefore, his plan had been to wear off Zangwill's helpers while smiting him from above the gray fog. It was akin to the sea battle with the demigod, Konas Kilgore, who was from the Black Emperor pathway back then. Even if he couldn't complete the kill due to a demigod's potency, he could stall for time until the Church of Evernight's archbishop or high-ranking deacons with sealed artifacts arrived. In this plan, there were 2 uncontrollable parameters. First, it was unpredictable how much influence 0-08 had towards the end. A card up his sleeve was to let Enzo set up a bestowment ritual and be prepared to send Grozel's travels to the real world at any time. By sending it to the edge of the battle, Klein wanted to know if this would lure the quill away from Zangwill. After all, he guessed that the quill was a Grade O sealed artifact of the Spectator pathway. It was likely that it was interested in the special book left behind by the Dragon of Imagination. Second, he wasn't sure how strong the son of the Creator, Adam, was. Klein had no reference point, and he believed that it wasn't impossible for a king of angels like him to subdue 0-08, imprison the Red Angel evil spirit, and kill Zangwill alone. Towards such a development, Klein had no means to foil it. All he could do was pray for the goddess's blessings and fate's tenderness as he waited for the outcome. Rumble. The lightning forest smote down, bringing with it intense destructive auras. At this moment, pure darkness surged out of the gaps in the lightning, devouring all of the silver-white swath. Right on the heels of that, Zangwill's 8 legs moved rapidly as he ran out of the area. He couldn't find a target of attack, nor could he lock onto the enemy that had cast lightning storm. Holding back his furious emotions, he ran towards buildings along the perimeter of the square, leaving shadowy afterimages behind. However, amidst booming thunder, terrifying lightning bolts smote down one after another, trapping Zangwill inside the square. Daly and Leonard had already woken up from their dreams, but the light from the lightning affected their vision, allowing them to discover that Zangwill had apparently turned into a monster, but the details were unclear. Mythical creature form. As the two had a solid foundation in mysticism, they immediately realized what was happening and quickly closed their eyes. They then retreated to a spot that provided them shelter. Realizing that he was unable to dodge the lightning strike given the amount of time he had, Zangwill retracted one of his legs, picked up 0-08, and as he ran, he wrote on his body, "An unknown existence is attracted by the combat and feels great pity for Zangwill's experiences before deciding to help him by taking him away via the spirit world." Chapter 940. For the fourth act on the heavily scuffed and damaged Revival Square, the environment turned dark as a gloominess and eeriness filled it in a seemingly corporeal manner. Even the blinding silver lightning wasn't able to dispel this feeling. Daily Simone acutely sensed that an unknown creature was crossing the spirit world and approaching. An ominous feeling rose up in her as though she could already see Zangwill using such an accident to easily escape, never to be found. She felt ice-cold in a manner that couldn't be resisted, just like when she first became a Beyonder. Back then, due to a particular accident, as a 19-year-old, she had lost her family and ended up drinking a potion by mistake. She ended up becoming a corpse collector and was placed into a Nighthawks team. The influence of the potion and the wounds from losing her family had made her enjoy gloominess and coldness. She couldn't help but approach corpses, often loitering in cemeteries and sleeping there. This made her appear odd, with people instinctively avoiding her. This not only dropped her body temperature, but it also slowly froze her heart and soul as they turned ice cold. She was afraid of this feeling. She still hoped to live as a person, hence, she instinctively used how men coveted her for her looks and body to gain a boyfriend. She wanted to use the warmth of a body to stop her soul from turning cold. In this decadent and surreal life, she met that man, a man who always warmly listened to her. He was a man who always stayed by her side and provided her help. He was a man who became embarrassed when faced with jokes involving the two sexes. He was a man who accepted all the flaws and weaknesses of his teammates with a sincere attitude. He was a man who fumbled in helplessness when she jested at him again and again. He was a man who hid the pain and sorrow in his heart, to the point of suffering an early receding hairline. He was a man who was the first to step forward when encountering danger, putting himself in between the danger and his teammates. She changed. She began putting on makeup that made her appear older. She stopped mixing with other men but kept her jokes to deliberately express that she hadn't changed in an obvious manner. However, she still didn't make it in time. She didn't manage to witness the man master the acting method, digest potions, and advance to sequence 6. She didn't manage to see him reach out his hand to invite her to an opening dance or be able to participate in his final battle. She didn't manage to tell him her feelings in time. I was wrong. I failed to do anything in time. Today, I'm not having it repeat again. Daly's expression turned sorrowful as the corners of lips curled bit by bit with tenderness and sweetness. With her eyes closed, she suddenly pulled out a small metal bottle from a hidden compartment. She threw the stopper and gulped the liquid inside. Her blue eyeshadow and blush instantly brightened, and even her skin turned slightly translucent. Her coiled-up hair was instantly released, pushing her hood back as they fluttered. Spirit wandering the void, higher-order creature that leave one with awe, the unforeseeable creature, Daly chanted with simple and forceful ancient Hermes, I shall sign a contract with you in my name, pray that you leave this place. Behind the 8-legged, the white-feathered Zangwill, a figure appeared. It was a blood-colored piece of flesh with countless eyes on it and arms of different races. Just as it was about to grab Zangwill and drag him into the spirit world, it suddenly paused. It then turned its gaze towards Daly Simone. Pitch-black snake-like scales instantly appeared on Daly's skin, and within the gaps of the scales, white feathers grew. Her knees buckled as she knelt down in pain, but she ultimately maintained her spirit-channeling posture. That quill began writing autonomously on Zangwill's body. The unknown existence descended upon Revival Square and was just about to take Zangwill away, but no, it was attracted by Daly Simone. Its sense of aesthetics was inclined towards humans. Oh no, it abandoned Zangwill. It decided to listen to Daly Simone's suggestion and ended up leaving. How surprising that when it came to spirit channeling, Zangwill, a demigod, would actually lose to sequence 5 Daly Simone. Although this lady had consumed the flower of spirit and paid an immense price, she had little chance to defeat Zangwill, who was barely using the quill of Alzahad. Zangwill was just too unlucky. He actually encountered a matter with nearly 0 probability. Amidst the lightning strikes, blood-red beams lit up in Zangwill's pitch-black eyes that were covered with mysterious symbols before calming down. His hand, which held the quill, wrote on his body once again. Another unknown existence was lured into the vicinity and attempted to enter the real world. Just as he wrote that, the quill suddenly paused as it continued writing, incoming. Incoming. No, she was Rionette Tinker. No, Rionette Tinker chased away all the surrounding creatures in the spirit world. She gave Zangwill a glance, looked away, and left, continuing her patrol of the surroundings. Zangwill is too unlucky, just too unlucky. Zangwill's rapidly moving body suddenly paused as though he had suffered a terrible blow. Boom! A thick bolt of silver-white lightning smote the 8-legged monster. It sent Zangwill flying up as he let out an inhuman cry. In his pitch-black eyes, the blood-red beam spread out like an explosion, turning into two bloodthirsty, cruel, and maniacal blobs of light. Zangwill could no longer control his emotions and maintain a good state of mind. He lost most of his reason. The more the slightly damaged quill wrote, the darker it became until it slowly stopped. With a scream that left one with goosebumps, an endless darkness blanketed the area, pulling Daly Simone and Leonard Mitchell into a dream. However, the thunder booms and lightning snapped the dreamers awake. Zangwill took a step back with his 8 legs, leaving behind an afterimage in his spot. He rapidly ran towards Daly Simone, who was on the brink of losing control, hoping to rip apart the Nighthawk who had foiled his plans for escaping. Boom! Boom! Ridiculous bolts of lightning blasted down, stopping his attempts to escape. Boom! Boom! The 8 legs, that were covered with white feathers, which now had signs of being charred, moved one after another as he kept his body low while he circled the square, dodging the lightning in search for an opportunity to kill Leonard and Daly. With time, he realized there was a problem with the remaining reason that he had. The frequency of the lightning was dropping. The person that kept casting lightning strike had apparently reached his limit, and his spirituality was almost drained. Zangwill's heart stirred as a cruel smile was plastered across his face. He ran at high speeds as he muttered in ancient Faesac, "All of you will die." He had apparently forgotten of his need to escape. All of you will die. Leonard Mitchell could do nothing despite hearing that sentence. It was because he couldn't even open his eyes. He couldn't determine where Zangwill was, nor use his spirituality to lock onto him. At this moment, he felt as if he had returned to Tingen, back to the Blackthorn Security Company, back to the day where they engaged Megos in an intense battle. He had returned to the time when he was weak and helpless, unable to stop anything himself. Back then, he clearly wanted to help Captain and Klein. Despite overcoming his horror, despite having Old Man to provide him with help, he quickly fainted due to his low sequence and lacking strength, thus, failing to participate in the subsequent battle. All he could do was wake up to see 2 corpses and use the pain of meeting family members to resolve the blame he placed on himself. He always cherished his leisurely life in Tingen City, the feeling of not needing to take any responsibility as if he was the protagonist. However, the more he cherished those memories, the more he hated his former self, wondering why he hadn't worked harder. With his eyes tightly closed, figures of light were darting around, and all he could do was ball his hands into a fist as he hurriedly shouted, "Old Man! Old Man!" This time, there wasn't any response in his mind. No one provided him any help, as Palaz Zorost was still in a deep sleep. Leonard's breathing turned heavy as he couldn't help but move his head from side to side with the darting of the light. Then, with a slightly hoarse voice, he shouted in clear anxiety, "Old Man! Old Man! Old Man!" His voice gradually softened, drowned by the thunder. Leonard hung his head bit by bit, his face filled with shame and pain. His lips quivered as he relaxed his hand and gripped it tight again. His entire body froze for several seconds. Suddenly, he wore a firm expression. With a grimace, he opened his mouth and chanted softly in ancient Hermes, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." Just as he said the prayers, he magically saw a scene in his mind. Zangwill, who had seemingly turned into a spider or some deformed feather wolf, was running frantically and dodging the lightning strikes. From time to time, he attempted to attack him and Daily Simone. And unlike normally, Ince Zangwill's figure appeared rather blurry in this scene. It was almost completely represented by red light, and it could only be used to determine his location. Leonard was first taken aback as he immediately laughed. Teardrops flowed down as he laughed. Without any hesitation, he raised his left palm, pressed the glove to his temple, and then tightly gripped the Fate Siphon charm with his right hand. Fate. The incomprehensible, mysterious word in ancient Hermes resounded as a transparent book appeared in front of Leonard. It flipped to a page amidst the ethereal chanting of, I came, I saw, I record, as he locked onto the 8-legged monster with white feathers growing all over him. Silver bolts of lightning blasted as Leonard Mitchell threw out the charm with a hideous expression, shouting, Die. Ince Zangwill. He had waited to say this for a very, very long time. He had played this scene in his head so many times. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.